Silas Vane's hand came down on the desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "You tell that woman," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter and far more dangerous than a shout, "that Black Ridge doesn't belong to people like her. It never did. And if she keeps poking around where she doesn't belong, she'll find out what this town does to people who don't know their place." The clerk standing across from him didn't move, didn't breathe. Vane straightened his coat, calm again in an instant, the way a man is calm when he has never once worried about consequences. "Now go. If you've ever been left with nothing, no money, no name, no one standing beside you, and you still got back up, then you already know what kind of woman Mara Bennett was. And if you haven't, stay with us. Because what she did next will make you question everything you thought you knew about who holds the power in this world." Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what's coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The train station at Black Ridge smelled like coal smoke and dried mud, and on the morning Mara Bennett stepped off the westbound platform, the wind was blowing hard enough to knock the breath sideways out of a person. She didn't stumble. She'd learned not to stumble in front of strangers. Her suitcase was the old brown leather one she'd carried since she left her mother's house in Missouri at 19. The latch on the left side didn't close all the way anymore, and she'd wound a strip of cotton cloth around it 3 times to hold it shut. She set it down on the platform boards and looked at Black Ridge the way a person looks at a place they weren't sure they wanted to see. It wasn't much. A main street that ran maybe 400 yards before it gave up and turned to open range. A hotel with a hand-lettered sign that had weathered badly. A feed store, a bank, a post office, 2 saloons, and a scattering of smaller establishments she couldn't make out from where she stood. Beyond all of it, the land stretched in every direction in that flat, relentless way that made people feel small whether they wanted to or not. Caleb was supposed to be waiting for her. She looked the length of the platform twice, then walked to the far end and looked again. A family was collecting luggage near the station house. A father, a mother, 3 children who were already fighting over something. A pair of ranch hands leaned against the wall smoking. An elderly woman sat on a bench near the door with a carpet bag in her lap and her eyes closed. "No, Caleb." Mara went inside and asked the station master if anyone had come in asking for a woman named Bennett. The station master was a thin man with a neck that looked too long for his collar. He barely glanced up from his papers. "Nobody like that today, ma'am." She sat down on one of the wooden benches along the wall and told herself he was late. The roads out here were nothing like Missouri. He'd said himself the last 20 miles into town were rough going, that the stage didn't run reliably, that things moved slower out west, and she'd have to get used to it. She was used to plenty of things. She could wait another hour. She waited too. The family left. The ranch hands left. The elderly woman was collected by a younger woman who arrived in a buckboard and helped her up without a word of greeting on us either side, which said everything about their relationship. The station master locked the ticket window and went somewhere in the back. Outside, the wind picked up. Mara opened her purse and counted what was inside for the 3rd time. Because the number didn't improve with counting, but doing something with her hands was better than sitting still. $4.32. She'd had $7 when she left Missouri, but the train fare had been longer than Caleb's estimate, and she'd had to eat twice on the journey, and there'd been the fee for the bag storage in Dodge City when she'd had a 3-hour layover. $4.32. She put the purse away. She was 31 years old. She had under $5 to her name. She was sitting in a train station in a town she'd never been to, and the man who had asked her to come here was not here. She sat with that for exactly as long as it took her to decide what it meant. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked back out onto the platform. A man was sweeping near the far end, one of the station's workers, older, with a face that had been weathered past the point of guessing his age. Mara walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said. "Is there a hotel in town that's decent and not too dear?" He looked at her for a moment, taking in the suitcase and the traveling clothes, and probably the expression she was carrying, which she knew even then was not the expression of a woman who wanted to be pitied. "The Langford," he said. 2 blocks up, turn left. Mrs. Cahill runs it. She's fair, thank you." She didn't ask anything else, and he didn't offer anything. She walked the 2 blocks, turned left, and pushed open the door of the Langford Hotel. Ruth Cahill was behind the desk when Mara walked in. She was a woman somewhere in her late 40s with iron gray hair pinned back without much attention to fashion and eyes that had the particular quality of taking stock of a person without making them feel judged for it. She looked at Mara, looked at the suitcase, and said, "Traveling alone?" "For now," Mara said, which was true in the only way that mattered. "Room's $1 a week." Meals included, but you eat with the household, not in your room, unless you're sick. I don't run a boarding house for people who want to hide, just people who need a roof. That suits me, Mara said. She paid $1 out of her 4 in change and carried her suitcase up the narrow stairs to the room. Ruth showed her a small square space with a window facing the street, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the back of the door. It was clean. That was what mattered. She sat down on the edge of the bed and let herself feel it for 30 seconds. The whole weight of it, the platform, the empty street, the count of $4.32, the particular quality of silence that settles over a person when they realize they have been very deliberately left behind. She let herself feel it, and then she put it away in the place where she kept the things she couldn't afford to carry in the open. Then she unpacked her suitcase, hung her second dress on the hook, set her small case of toiletries on the washstand, and went back downstairs to see if Ruth Cahill needed any help with supper. Ruth was in the kitchen, working alone over a stove that was slightly too large for the space. She looked over her shoulder when Mara came in and said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to do that," Ruth said. "I know," Mara said. "Is there a knife?" Ruth studied her for another moment and then nodded toward the block on the counter. "Potatoes need peeling." They worked side by side for a while without talking, which Mara found easier than conversation, and Ruth seemed to share the preference for. The kitchen was warm and smelled like something that had been simmering most of the afternoon, and outside the window the light was starting to go orange the way it only does on flat land where the sky has no obstacles. Finally, Ruth said, without looking up from the pot, "You came in on the afternoon train." "Yes, alone, yes." A pause. The sound of a spoon against the pot. "I'm not going to ask," Ruth said. "I appreciate that," Mara said. But Ruth did ask. Eventually, not that evening, but the next morning over coffee, and not as a question so much as a space she left open, the way some people do who have learned that silence is an invitation people will fill when they're ready. And Mara filled it, not with everything, but with enough. She told Ruth that she'd come out to Black Ridge to meet a man she'd been corresponding with for 8 months. A man who had told her he wanted to build something together, who had told her the frontier was full of possibility, who had laid out a very convincing picture of a future that turned out to belong to someone else's life. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Mara stopped talking, Ruth poured more coffee into both cups and said, "What did you do before?" "Accounting," Mara said. "I kept books for a dry goods firm in Kansas City for 4 years. Before that, a hardware supplier in St. Louis." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You're good with numbers. I'm very good with numbers." Ruth nodded once, slowly, the way a person nods when something that hadn't occurred to them suddenly becomes clear. "I might know of something," she said. "Not guaranteed, but there's a man who comes in twice a month for dinner, rancher. Land east of town. Been running that place since his wife passed 2 years ago. His bookkeeping has been, by all accounts, an estate. He mentioned it once, just once, but I remembered." "What's his name?" Mara asked. "Cole," Ruth said. "Ethan Cole." Mara reached for her coffee. "Tell me about him." Ruth told her what she knew, which was the kind of knowledge a woman who runs a hotel accumulates without trying things people say at dinner, things you overhear when guests think they're being quiet, the shape of a person as seen from behind the desk over the course of years. Ethan Cole was 38, had come to Black Ridge 12 years ago with his wife Margaret, and built his ranch from a single parcel to a substantial operation. Margaret had died of fever 22 months ago, and since then the ranch had continued to function more from momentum than management. He had no children. He was not a man who complained or confided, which meant you could only tell what was wrong with him by what he didn't say. And what he didn't say, Ruth had noticed, was anything about the ranch's finances, which to her way of thinking meant either they were fine and there was nothing to say, or they were a problem he didn't know how to start talking about. Mara thought about that on her walk that afternoon, the first time she'd really looked at Black Ridge, with the intention of understanding it rather than just enduring it. She walked the main street from end to end, stopped in the feed store to buy nothing and look at everything, paused outside the bank long enough to note the name on the window, First Territory Bank, which was not a name that told you much, and then doubled back to the hotel by a slightly different route, past a row of modest houses and a small building that might have been a law office, or might have been something else. The town had a feeling to it that she couldn't quite name yet. Not unfriendly, exactly, but watchful. The way a place watches when it has decided you are a visitor and hasn't yet decided whether it wants you to stay. She went back to the hotel and helped Ruth with the evening meal and said nothing more about Ethan Cole. She didn't have to. 3 days later, he came in for dinner the way Ruth had said he would, and Ruth introduced them with the straightforward simplicity of a woman who believed in getting to the point. "Mara Bennett, she's staying with us for the moment. She does accounts. Ethan Cole, he needs someone to do accounts." And then she went back to the kitchen. Ethan Cole was a tall man, not especially broad, with the kind of steadiness in his build that comes from outdoor work rather than any natural inclination toward size. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, eyes that were some shade between gray and green depending on the light, and hands that were calloused in the way that ranch work calluses hands, not from a single hard season, but from years of it becoming ordinary. He didn't look like a man who had any idea how to take advantage of the situation, which was either reassuring or naive, and she hadn't known him long enough to be certain which. He asked her to sit down. They ate at the same table, Ruth having arranged matters so that two of the regular boarders were eating in the sitting room that evening, which Mara suspected was deliberate and said nothing about. Over the meal, Ethan asked her questions, straightforward ones, the kind a careful person asks when they're trying to understand something without committing to anything. What kind of work had she done before? What systems she was familiar with? Whether she knew cattle operations specifically or just general accounting. She answered him honestly. She knew general ledger, accounts payable, accounts receivable, contract management, supplier record. She didn't know cattle operations specifically, but she knew how to learn a new set of accounts faster than most people expected. She had references she could write to Kansas City for, if he wanted them, though the mail would take time. She told him the salary she'd expect, and watched his face for the wince that would tell her she'd miscalculated. He didn't wince. He said the number sounded reasonable, and he'd like to think about it overnight. The next morning he came back to the hotel before she'd finished her second cup of coffee and told her the job was hers if she wanted it. She said she wanted it. He said she could ride out to the ranch that afternoon, and he'd show her the state of things. She said that was fine. He nodded, started to leave, then stopped and looked at her with something she couldn't quite categorize yet. Not sympathy, not pity. Something more like the look of a person who is also trying to figure out what they've gotten themselves into. I should tell you, he said, the records are not in good shape. Margaret handled everything, and after, well, nobody picked it up. That's usually how it goes, Mara said. I'm not sure how bad it is. It's usually worse than people think, she said, and that's all right. I've seen worse. It's easier to fix than it is to see clearly when you're the one who's been living with it. He looked at her for another moment and then said, all right, and left. Ruth came in from the kitchen and said without preamble, he's a decent man. I didn't say anything, I know, Ruth said, but you were thinking. Mara allowed that this was true. The ride to Ethan Cole's ranch took 40 minutes, traveling the road east out of Black Ridge, past a series of properties that ranged from well-managed to clearly struggling. Ethan drove the buckboard and pointed out the neighboring parcels as they passed the Calder place to the north, which ran sheep and a small dairy, the Prescott Ranch, which was the largest operation in that stretch of country, and raised cattle and horses both, a smaller parcel belonging to a widow named Lila Hatch, who'd been running it alone since her husband died 4 years prior. He talked about these neighbors the way a man talks about people he's known long enough to take for granted, which meant he mentioned their names and then didn't explain anything about them, assuming she'd gather the rest. She was gathering it. She was gathering everything. The Cole Ranch was not what she'd expected, which was stupid of her, because she hadn't known what to expect. It was larger than she'd pictured from Ruth's description, a main house, a separate bunkhouse for the hands, a barn that was plainly recently repaired on one side, a series of fenced pastures running back toward a line of low hills to the east. The land was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it had the kind of scale that made you adjust your sense of what ordinary looked like, the sky taking up more of your vision than you were used to, and the horizon line sitting low and definite in every direction. The house itself was clean but spare, in the way of a house where someone had cared about it, and then the caring had stopped, not through neglect but through loss. There were still small things she noticed that must have been Margaret Cole's choices, a certain color of curtain fabric, a way of arranging things on a shelf, but they sat in the rooms like objects in a museum, carefully preserved and completely unvisited. He showed her the study, which was where the records were kept, or had been kept, and which now was a careful disaster. There were 2 ledgers on the desk, 3 more on the shelf, a wooden crate on the floor containing what appeared to be 2 years' worth of supplier invoices in loose piles, and a secondary crate beside it that held something that might have been correspondence, or might have been a completely separate category of document that no one had sorted. On the desk there was also a coffee cup, a jar of pencils, and a glass paperweight that had no particular purpose. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. I told you, Ethan said from behind her. You did, she said. Is it? Give me an hour and I'll know what we're dealing with. He gave her 2, coming back to find her sitting at the desk with both ledgers open, and the supplier invoices sorted into 3 piles paid, unpaid, and a third pile in the middle that she'd labeled in her own handwriting with a folded piece of paper, questionable. The third pile was the largest. She looked up when he came in and said, without softening it, The ranch itself is in better shape than I expected. Your operating accounts are behind, but not dangerously. Your livestock records are actually quite good. Someone was keeping those up. One of your hands? Tommy said. He's been with me 12 years. Tell him to keep doing exactly what he's doing. The supplier side I want to talk about. She tapped the middle pile. These invoices, the ones from a company called Vane Supply, have been running significantly higher than market rate for at least a year, possibly longer. I'd need to look at older records to be sure. Ethan's expression changed in a way that was hard to read, not surprise exactly, and not quite alarm. Something in between, the look of a person who has had a feeling about something for a long time and is now looking at the confirmation of it. Silas Vane, he said. You know him, it wasn't a question, but he answered it. Everyone in this county knows Silas Vane. Mara set down her pencil. Tell me. And so he did, standing in the doorway of his study, while the afternoon light came through the window and the papers sat in their sorted piles between them. Ethan Cole told her about Silas Vane, the businessman who had come to Black Ridge 6 years ago with capital from somewhere back east and a very smooth way of talking about opportunity, who had acquired the territory's main supply company and 3/4 of its banking interests and a set of commercial relationships that ran through almost every ranch and farm operation within 40 miles, who smiled at everyone and helped no one, who sat on the town council and said exactly the right things at exactly the right times and knew, somehow, where every important piece of land in the county was and what it was worth, which was often considerably more than its owners realized. Mara listened to all of this without interrupting. When Ethan was done, she was quiet for a moment. How long has Vane Supply been your primary supplier? She asked. About 2 years. And you've never noticed the prices climbing? He shifted his weight slightly, which, she was already learning, was what he did when something made him uncomfortable. I notice, he said. Prices go up, that's just the way of things. Not like this, they don't, Mara said, and turned the ledger around so he could see the columns she'd marked. She walked him through it the way she would have walked a client through it back in Kansas City, not assuming he was stupid, not explaining things twice, just setting out the numbers in the order that told the story most clearly. The base prices from 18 months ago, the current prices, the difference, the percentage, the total amount that had left the ranch in overpayments over that period. The number was not small. Ethan looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at her. This isn't just us, he said. No, she said, it's not. If he's doing this to every ranch in the county, then someone's been bleeding this whole territory dry. One invoice at a time, Mara said, quietly enough that nobody's noticed because they're all too close to their own books to see the pattern. She paused. I'd want to look at other records, your neighbors. Anyone willing to let me go through their supplier accounts. Ethan was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is weighing something that's larger than what he'd expected to be weighing when he came back into this room. That's a serious thing to be doing, he said. If Vane finds out someone's looking into his business, then he'll do something about it, Mara said simply. He probably already has ways of knowing when people start asking questions. Men like that usually do. And that doesn't concern you? She looked at him steadily. I've been concerned about considerably worse this week, she said. Numbers I can deal with. Show me what's wrong, and I'll tell you exactly what it is and how to prove it. Another pause, longer this time. Then Ethan pulled the chair away from the wall and sat down across from her, the desk between them, and said, All right, start at the beginning. Tell me what we need. She started at the beginning. She told him exactly what they needed. Outside, the wind had dropped and the light was going long and golden over the Prescott land to the south. Inside the study of the coal ranch, Mara Bennett spread the ledgers and invoices across the desk and began the slow, meticulous work of building a case out of numbers, which was the one thing in her life she had always known how to do. She had $4.32 when she stepped off the train at Black Ridge. She had considerably less than that now. But she was sitting at a desk with a purpose and a problem, and a man across from her who was listening to her the way people listen when they understand that the person talking knows something they need to know. For the first time since she'd stood on that platform looking at an empty street, Mara Bennett felt the specific, quiet, entirely reliable steadiness of a woman who has found her footing. She didn't know yet what Silas Vane was capable of. She didn't know yet that Caleb Mercer was in Black Ridge. She didn't know yet how far this would go, or how dangerous it would become, or what it would cost her before it was finished. But she opened the ledger to the first page, and she started working, and for now that was enough. The first thing Mara did the morning after she'd sorted Ethan's records was go back through the supplier invoices one more time, from the beginning, because she had learned long ago that the first pass through any set of accounts tells you what's wrong, and the second pass tells you how wrong it is, and those are almost never the same number. She was right. The second pass was worse. She'd been working at the desk since before sunrise, using the lamp Ethan had left burning on the corner of the desk the night before without being asked, which told her something about him, that he paid attention to things without making a performance of it. The ranch had been quiet around her for most of the early morning, just the sound of the hands moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, the occasional low sound of cattle somewhere out in the dark. She'd barely noticed any of it. She was counting. By the time Ethan came in from the morning chores with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the corner of the desk within her reach, she had filled 3 pages of her own notebook with figures. He sat down across from her and waited. He had the patience of a man who'd spent years working with animals, which meant he'd learned that pushing something before it was ready just made things harder. 18 months, she said without looking up. That's how far back I can go with what you have here. The overcharges start cleanly at the beginning of that period, which means either Vane changed his pricing practices about 18 months ago, or someone who knew how to read accounts started paying attention, and he had to be more careful before that. Or, Ethan said. She looked up. He was watching her over his coffee cup. Or Margaret was handling the accounts before, and she noticed, he said. She was sharp about money, always had been. Mara put down her pencil. The weight of that settled in the room for a moment, not the grief of it, which was his to carry, but the practical implication which was hers. When did she get sick, she asked. Started about 2 years ago. By 18 months ago, she couldn't do much anymore. So Vane waited, Mara said. He waited until she wasn't watching, and then he started. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Ethan set his cup down on the edge of the desk and looked at the surface of it, not at anything in particular, just the flat wood. He was doing that thing people do when something true lands harder than they expected it to. I need to go through your neighbor's records, Mara said. The Prescotts and anyone else who uses Vane supply. If this is only your ranch, it's one thing. But if the pattern matches across multiple properties, same pricing, same timeline, that's not a supplier who raised his rates. That's a plan. Clara Prescott won't be easy to convince, Ethan said. She's private. The ranch has been in her family since her father built it, and she doesn't like outside eyes on her business. Is she in trouble? I don't know. I don't think she knows either, which is different from being in good shape. Then she needs to know, Mara said. He looked at her directly. You want me to talk to her? I think it'll go better coming from you. You've known her for years. I'm still the woman who showed up on the train last week with a broken suitcase. There was something in the way he looked at her then, not pity. She was certain of that, more like the way a person looks at someone who has said something more honest than they expected. The latch, he said. The latch? On your suitcase. I noticed when I helped you load it. She hadn't known he'd noticed. It was a small thing, the kind of detail that shouldn't matter. She picked her pencil back up. I'll get it fixed when I have the money, she said. Talk to Clara Prescott. He talked to Clara Prescott that afternoon. And by the following day, Mara was sitting at the Prescott kitchen table with a stack of supplier invoices in front of her, and Clara Prescott standing 3 feet away with her arms folded and an expression that made it very clear she was allowing. This out of respect for Ethan Cole, and not because she had any particular faith in a woman she'd known for 4 days. Clara was somewhere in her mid-50s with white hair she wore in a single heavy braid down her back, and the particular kind of uprightness in her posture that comes from decades of being the person others wait for before they act. She'd been running the Prescott Ranch alone since her husband Devereaux had died 7 years ago, not just running it but expanding it, which was a thing that almost no one had expected her to do, and which she had done without acknowledging that anyone expected anything one way or the other. Mara went through the Prescott invoices the same way she'd gone through Ethan's, and the pattern appeared within the first 20 minutes. Same pricing inflation, same timeline, same supplier. She set down her pencil and looked up at Clara, who was watching her with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something tighter and harder. How much? Clara asked. Mara told her. Clara's jaw set. She unfolded her arms and walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the land her father had built, and her husband had grown, and she had kept, and Mara waited, because this was not a moment that benefited from being hurried. There's a bank loan, Clara said finally, without turning around. $12,000. I took it out 8 months ago to cover operating costs after what looked like a bad season. I blamed the weather. A pause. I blamed myself. Mara looked at her figures. The overcharges in the Prescott accounts over the relevant period added up to just under $11,000. Don't blame yourself, she said. Clara turned around. Her face was composed in the way of someone who has decided that composure is the only thing standing between her and something she cannot afford to feel right now. If I'd been paying closer attention. He was careful, Mara said. Each individual invoice only ran about 8 to 12% above what you'd expect to pay. That's not the kind of thing you catch unless you're looking at all of them together and comparing them to market rates. It's designed to be invisible. Clara stared at her. Designed, yes. Another silence. Then Clara said very quietly, That loan is due in 6 months. If I can't cover it, the bank forecloses. First Territory Bank? Mara asked. Yes. Why? Mara said nothing for a moment, writing something in her notebook. Who owns the bank? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. Clara looked at her with a particular expression. Vane has a controlling interest. Has for 3 years. Mara closed her notebook. I need to see who else in this county uses Vane Supply, she said. And I need to see the loan records, not just yours. Anyone who's taken out loans in the last 2 years. If the bank is part of this, she stopped. Say it, Clara said. If the bank is part of this, then the loans aren't incidental. They're the point. The inflated prices drain money out of the ranches get into debt, they go to the bank for loans, and when they can't pay, Mara laid her pencil down flat on the table. He gets the land. The two women looked at each other across Clara Prescott's kitchen table, and in the silence what passed between them was the particular recognition of two people who have just understood the same terrible thing at the same moment. The Prescott land, Clara said slowly. Your water access, Mara said. I don't know this country well yet, but Ethan told me your property controls the main water source for about 1,200 acres downstream. Anyone who owns my land controls water rights for half the county. Yes. Clara put her hand on the back of one of the kitchen chairs and gripped it, not sitting down, just holding it. How long has he been planning this? I don't know yet, Mara said, but I'm going to find out. She rode back to the coal ranch that evening, with 2 notebooks full of figures, and a feeling in her chest that was not quite fear, but was in the same neighborhood, the feeling of understanding the shape of something large and dangerous, before you know how large and dangerous it actually is. Ethan was waiting on the porch, which she suspected was not because he'd been waiting specifically, but because he often ended up on the porch in the evenings the way people do when a house is quiet, in a way they haven't entirely made peace with. She climbed down from the horse and told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment in the cooling evening air. We need to go to the sheriff, he said. Not yet, Mara said. He looked at her. Not without more, she said. Right now we have inflated invoices and a theory. Vane will say it's market pricing, that rates fluctuate, that we don't understand the supply chain. We need documentation from multiple properties, a clear timeline, and ideally something that shows the bank loans and the price increases are coordinated. Otherwise we walk into the sheriff's office with a complaint, and he walks out of Vane's office the next day, knowing exactly what we have. You think the sheriff? I think Vane has been operating in this county for 6 years and nobody has stopped him yet, Mara said. Either he's very careful or he has protection or both. I don't know which yet. But I'm not walking into a room to accuse a powerful man in front of people I don't know yet with half a case. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. So what do? We get the rest of the ranches, she said. Anyone who uses Vane Supply. We go through their records the same way. We build the full picture before we show it to anyone. That's going to take weeks probably, she said. Can you get the neighbors to cooperate? He thought about it. Most of them. Tom Calder might be difficult, he's cautious. Doesn't like getting involved in other people's business. Lila Hatch will probably do it just out of anger. The Fenn brothers, if they're running the same kind of debt I think they are, they'll want to know. He paused. There are a few others. Start with the ones you trust. Don't explain more than they need to know to agree, and don't talk about it in town. He looked at her steadily. Do you think someone's already watching? I think a man who was careful enough to design this was careful enough to have eyes out, she said. Yes. The next 2 weeks were the kind of work that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Long days. A great deal of writing, stacks of papers in borrowed kitchens and cramped studies, numbers that had to be coaxed out of records, kept in 3 different systems by people with 3 different ideas of what accounting meant. Mara moved through the neighboring properties methodically, taking what she needed, leaving behind the minimum necessaries explanation, keeping her notebook close, and her conclusions to herself until she had enough to be certain. The pattern held on every ranch she visited. It held on the Calder property where Tom Calder sat across from her with his big rough hands on the table and said nothing for a very long time after she showed him his numbers and then said, My father always told me a man who makes himself necessary makes himself dangerous, and Mara didn't know whether he was talking about Vane or himself. It held on Lila Hatch's place, where the widow looked at the figures and said, with a calm fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been, He came here after Henry died and offered to help me set up my supply accounts. He said he wanted to make sure I was taken care of. She said the last 4 words the way you say something you want to set on fire. It held on the Fenn brothers' operation where the older one, Garrett, looked at the paper Mara handed him and said, We borrowed $8,000 from the bank in January, and his brother James said nothing, just put his hat on the table in front of him and looked at the wall. By the end of the 2nd week, Mara had records from 6 properties including the coal ranch and the Prescott operation. The total in overcharges, across all of them, over 18 months, was just under $70,000. The total in outstanding bank loans on properties that had taken debt during the same period was over $90,000. She sat alone in Ethan's study the night she finished the final calculation and looked at that number for a long time. $70,000, drained out of this county a few hundred at a time on a stack of paper, that each individual rancher had looked at and thought was just the cost of doing business in hard times. $90,000 in debt that would allow a bank with controlling interest, held by the same man, to foreclose on properties the moment the payments fell short, which they would, because the overcharges had made certain of it. She understood now why Silas Vane was always the first person to offer condolences when a ranch family had a bad year. He already knew how bad it would be. He'd made it that way. She was still sitting at the desk when she heard the sound of a horse on the road outside, and then a few minutes later, the knock at the study door. Ethan opened it and stood in the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "Someone came to the ranch gate," he said. One of the hands turned him away, but he stopped. "Who was it?" she asked. "Said his name was Mercer," Ethan said. "Caleb Mercer. He asked for you." The room was very quiet for a moment. Mara put down her pencil. She was aware of her own hands on the desk. Very still, the way hands get still when everything else in a body is suddenly paying attention. She had not heard that name since Missouri. She had not expected to hear it in Black Ridge. She was trying to decide very quickly what it meant that she was hearing it here, in this place now. "Did he say what he wanted?" she said. Her voice came out even, which was an achievement. "Said he needed to speak with you. Said it was personal. Personal." She looked at her notebook, at the figures she'd been assembling for 2 weeks, at the names of the ranches and the numbers beside them, and the date at the top of the page where she'd started this work. 18 months ago. Vane Supply, First Territory Bank. "Ethan," she said. "How long has Caleb Mercer been in Black Ridge?" Ethan's expression shifted slightly. "I don't know. I've never heard the name before tonight." "Why?" She closed the notebook. "I need to think," she said. "Don't let him back to the gate, and don't tell anyone he came." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mara, please," she said, "just give me tonight." He gave her the night. She spent it not sleeping, sitting at the desk with the lamp turned down low, going back over the sequence of events the way she went back over a column of figures, when she suspected an error methodically, from the beginning testing each entry against what she knew. Caleb had written to her first 8 months before she'd stepped off that train. The letters had been warm and deliberate, thoughtful in a way that she had taken for genuine character, and which she now suspected was something else entirely. He'd told her about Black Ridge with the specificity of a man who knew it well. He'd encouraged her to leave Kansas City. He'd described opportunity in the West with a fluency that didn't quite match what she'd found when she arrived, but she'd attributed that to the difference between description and reality, between the way people talked about places and the way places actually were. He'd known about her work. She had told him in those letters about her accounting experience, about the cases she'd worked on in Kansas City, including a supplier fraud investigation that had ended with a civil judgment and 2 people losing their business licenses. She had told him because it had seemed relevant, the way you tell a person who might become your future what your past was made of. She sat very still in the quiet of Ethan Cole's study and thought about what it would mean if those letters had not been the work of a man looking for a wife. She thought about what it would mean if Silas Vane had known, somehow, that a woman who could read supplier accounts was likely to end up in Black Ridge, and had wanted her to arrive in a particular condition alone, stranded, without resources, with her credibility already damaged by the story of a woman abandoned at a train station. She thought about how much easier it would be to dismiss the findings of a woman like that, if it ever came to dismissing her findings in front of a judge. She thought about it until the lamp burned low and the first gray light started coming through the study window, and by the time Ethan's cook had started moving around in the kitchen, she had reached a conclusion she didn't like but could not argue with. She had been brought here deliberately, not because Caleb Mercer wanted a future with her, because Silas Vane had wanted a woman who knew accounts placed in this county where she would find nothing and be believed by no one. He'd miscalculated on the second part. She stood up from the desk, stretched the stiffness out of her back, and went to find Ethan. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, looking like a man who had also not slept especially well, which she filed away without comment. She sat down across from him and said, "I need to talk to Clara Prescott and Ruth Cahill today. Both of them. Together if possible." He looked at her over his cup. "What happened? I figured something out," she said. "I'll explain when we're all together. It's faster that way." And Mercer, she looked at him steadily. "He's connected to Vane." Whatever Ethan had been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. She watched him absorb it, the way his expression moved through something she couldn't name, before settling back into the steadiness he carried most of the time. "You're sure?" "No," she said, "not yet. But I'm working from the assumption that I'm right until I can prove otherwise. Because if I'm wrong, the cost is that I'm too careful. And if I'm right, the cost of being too trusting is something I can't afford." He nodded once, slowly. "I need you to find out when Mercer arrived in town," she said, quietly, "and whether anyone saw him talking to Vane or anyone connected to Vane's business." "Ruth would know," he said. "If he's staying in town, he'd be at the hotel or one of the boarding houses, and Ruth hears things. Then let's start with Ruth." They went into Black Ridge that morning, the two of them, which was not unusual enough to attract attention. Ethan came to town regularly for supplies and other business, and Mara was beginning to be a recognizable enough presence that people had stopped looking at her with the particular attention reserved for complete strangers. Ruth Cahill met them in the small sitting room off the hotel lobby, with a look that said she already knew something was happening and had been waiting to find out what. She knew about Caleb Mercer before they told her. "He'd arrived 4 days ago," she said, before Mara had met him on the platform. No, that wasn't right. She hadn't met him at all. He hadn't come to the station, which was the point. He'd come in on the stage, not the train, from the north, which was the direction of the territory capital, not the east where Mara had come from. He was staying at the other hotel, the one on the far end of Main Street that Ruth had opinions about. And he'd had dinner, on his second evening in town, at the same restaurant where Silas Vane dined every Thursday. "Same table?" Mara asked. "Different tables," Ruth said, "but the same room," and they acknowledged each other. "I only know this because the woman who does their laundry also does mine." "You have a good network," Mara said. "I run a hotel," Ruth said. "You either pay attention or you get run over." Mara told them both, then told them the full shape of what she'd assembled, from the first overcharge in Ethan's ledger to the final calculation of $90,000 in bank debt. Told them about the night she'd spent at the desk. Told them her conclusion about Caleb. Ruth listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still. Ethan sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor, and she knew he was recalculating things, going back through his own history with Vane's supply, looking for the moments he should have seen. When she was finished, Ruth said, "So he brought you here to be discredited." "That's my read," Mara said. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance," Ruth said. "We need a federal attorney," Mara said. "Someone from outside the county, outside the territory if possible. Someone Vane can't reach. If we take this to a local judge with Vane's connections, we lose before we start. But if we have a federal action, with documentation from 6 properties, with a clear pattern of fraud and coordinated loan manipulation," she paused. "He can't talk his way out of that. Not if the evidence is airtight." "Gerald Forsythe," Ruth said. Both Mara and Ethan looked at her. "He's a federal attorney based in the territory capital," Ruth said. "He handled a land fraud case 3 counties east of here 2 years ago. He won. He's not connected to Vane. I made a point of looking into that when I first started noticing things about how this town works." She said this without any particular drama, just a statement of fact. "You've been watching Vane," Ethan said. "I've been watching everything," Ruth said. "That's what I do. I just didn't have the numbers." She looked at Mara. "Now we do." Mara looked at her notebook, at the careful columns she'd spent 2 weeks assembling. She thought about what Vane would do when he realized the investigation was no longer informal. She thought about Caleb Mercer in his hotel room on the far end of Main Street, who had come here for a purpose that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with making sure she couldn't do what she was currently doing. She thought about standing on that train platform with $4.32 and nowhere to go. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. "Tell me everything you know about Gerald Forsythe," she said, Ruth told her. And while she talked, Mara wrote, because that was what she did. She took information and turned it into something that could be used. And right now what she needed was every advantage she could build before Silas Vane figured out that the woman he'd arranged to have stranded in Black Ridge was not stranded at all. She was 3 weeks into the best work she'd ever done, and she was only getting started. That afternoon, without planning to, she encountered Caleb Mercer on the main street of Black Ridge. He was coming out of the post office as she was passing it, and there was a half second where they both had the option to pretend they hadn't seen each other, and he didn't take it. He said her name. She stopped. She turned. She looked at him the way she'd been thinking about looking at him for most of the previous night, steadily. Without the heat she'd felt in Missouri, without the wound of the platform, with nothing except the clear-eyed regard of a woman who has figured out what she's dealing with. He looked the same. That was the first thing she noticed. And the cruelest, he looked exactly the same. The same easy face, the same way of standing that suggested he was comfortable in any situation, which she now understood was not the ease of a confident man, but the ease of a practiced one. "Mar," he said again. "Caleb," she said. I came to explain. No, she said. He blinked. He'd expected something else, anger, tears, a door shut in his face. Not this flat, quiet no. I came a long way, he said. So did I, she said. And I'm busy. She looked at him for one more moment, long enough to make it clear she had taken his measure and found it wanting. Short enough to make it clear she wasn't going to waste any more of her afternoon on it, and then she walked on. She heard him say her name one more time behind her. She didn't stop. She had 63 pages of documented fraud in her notebook, the name of a federal attorney, and a network of ranchers who were ready to act. She had Ruth Cahill's intelligence and Clara Prescott's fury, and Ethan Cole's steady, quiet reliability, which she was beginning to understand was worth more than it looked. Caleb Mercer had come to Black Ridge to watch her fail. She was going to make certain he had a very long wait. The letter to Gerald Forsythe went out on a Tuesday, carried by Tom, Ethan's longest-serving hand, who was told only that it needed to reach the territory capital without going through the regular post office in Black Ridge. Tom asked no questions. He'd worked for Ethan Cole for 12 years and understood that sometimes the way you moved information mattered as much as the information itself. Mara had written the letter 3 times before she was satisfied with it. The first draft was too emotional. She could feel the anger in it, the tight, controlled fury of a woman who had been used as a prop in someone else's scheme, and she knew that a federal attorney reading a letter from a woman he'd never heard of would give it exactly the weight it deserved, which was none. The second draft was too technical, a wall of figures that told the story but left out the shape of it. The third draft was what she wanted: clear, specific, numbered, with enough of the human cost laid out plainly to make the case for urgency without sounding like a plea. She sealed it herself and gave it to Tom at the barn before anyone else was up. Then she went back to the desk and went on working. The days had taken on a particular rhythm by now. Mornings at the Cole Ranch, going through whatever she hadn't finished the night before. Afternoons, when needed, at one of the neighboring properties, collecting what remained to be collected. Evenings with Ethan, often at the kitchen table after the hands had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, going over what she'd found and what it meant. He was a useful person to think with, which surprised her and then stopped surprising her, because she'd noticed early on that he was a man who listened more than he talked and thought more than he listened, which was a rare combination. What didn't fit into any of this, and what she couldn't quite file away the way she'd filed away other things, was Caleb Mercer. He was still in Black Ridge. Ruth's network confirmed this. Every few days he was at the Far Hotel. He was seen at the restaurant. He had been observed once going into the office of a man named Britt, who served as a legal agent for various commercial interests in the county, Vane's among them. That last item had confirmed what Mara already suspected but had not yet been able to prove. Caleb's presence in Blackwood was not personal. He was here as an instrument. The question she hadn't answered yet was exactly what Vane had sent him to do. She got the answer on a Thursday, 3.5 weeks after she'd walked past him on Main Street without stopping. He came to the ranch, not to the gate this time, to the front porch, in broad daylight, while Mara was inside and 2 of the hands were working the near pasture where they could see the road. Ethan was in town. She heard the knock and came to the door herself, because the cook was in the back of the house and she wasn't the kind of woman who waited for someone else to answer her door. Caleb stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, which she noted because it was a performance of humility that didn't reach his eyes. He was dressed well. He always had been. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not built for it." Something moved across his face, not quite hurt, more like the expression of someone who'd expected a softer opening and had to recalibrate. "Mara, can we talk? We're talking inside?" "No." He looked down at his hat for a moment, turning it in his hands. She waited. She had learned these past weeks that waiting was one of the most effective things you could do in a conversation you hadn't started. "He knows you're building something," Caleb said finally. "I assumed he would. He's not going to let it get to a court." He said this carefully, like a man delivering a message he's not entirely comfortable with, but has decided to deliver anyway. "Has arrangements with the judge here, and with 2 of the town council. If you file anything locally—" "I'm not filing locally," she said. He looked up. "I wrote to Gerald Forsythe 3 weeks ago," she said. "I expect a reply in the next week or 2. If you're here to find out what I have and what I'm planning to do with it, you can tell Vane that what I have is $70,000 in documented overcharges across 6 properties and $90,000 in bank loans he arranged to foreclose on land he wanted. Tell him I have witnesses, I have ledgers, and I have contracts. Tell him I have 18 months of his handwriting on invoices that don't match market rates." She paused. "Or don't tell him. Either way, he'll find out soon enough." Caleb's expression had changed while she was talking, shifting through several things before settling on something she hadn't expected, something that looked almost like relief, which told her more than anything he'd said. "He's going to go after the Prescott place," Caleb said quietly. He's already started. He moved the timeline up. The offer goes in next week. Way below value. He's counting on Clara not having anywhere else to turn. She studied him. Why are you telling me this? He didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the land, beyond the porch, the road, the open range past the fence line. She waited. Because I read your letters, he said. The ones you wrote me, the real ones. He looked back at her. He gave me your name and your history and told me what he needed. I did what he asked. But the letters you wrote, he started again. You were real in those letters. And I'm not sure I've been real in anything I've done in about 5 years. She looked at him for a long time. She was deciding how much of that to believe and how much to use. If you want to help, she said finally, you'll put that in writing. Everything he told you to do. How he knew about my background. What he expected me to do when I arrived. What he's planning for the Prescott property. A written statement signed that I can give to Forsyth. Caleb's mouth tightened. That's a considerable risk for me. I know it is, she said, so think about it. She stepped back into the doorway. But don't think too long. If he moves on the Prescott ranch next week, I'll need that statement before the week is out. She shut the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, her back against the door, and breathed. She was shaking slightly, which she hadn't expected. She'd been calm through the whole conversation, absolutely controlled, and the body was catching up now that the performance was over, not fear. Something more like the physical residue of holding very still under pressure. She pushed away from the door and went back to the study. Ethan came home 2 hours later, and she told him about the visit without softening anything. He listened, standing in the doorway the way he often did, and when she was done, he said, Do you believe him? About Vane moving on the Prescott place? I believe he's telling the truth about that part, yes. And the rest of it? She considered. I think some of it is true, and some of it is a man who got in too deep, and is now trying to position himself on the right side, before things fall apart. The question is whether the useful parts are true enough to act on. What do we do about Clara? We go to her tonight, Mara said, and we tell her everything. She needs to know what's coming before it arrives at her door. They drove to the Prescott ranch as the sun was going down, the two of them in Ethan's buckboard, the road dusty and the light going red behind the hills to the west. Clara Prescott met them on her porch with the expression of a woman who had learned that visitors arriving at dusk rarely brought good news. She was right. Mara told her about the timeline, about Vane's offer, about the water rights and why they were the real prize at the end of this particular chain of events. Clara listened without interrupting, her arms at her sides this time rather than folded, which Mara had come to understand was not a sign of ease, but of the deepest kind of controlled anger, the kind where you stop bracing yourself because you've accepted that the thing is already here. When Mara was done, Clara said, What does he think I'm going to do? Just sell? He thinks the loan pressure and the operating costs have put you in a position where you don't have another option, Mara said. He's been engineering that position for 18 months. Clara's jaw set so hard you could see it in the failing light. My father dug those water channels by hand, she said. Him and 3 hired men and 2 mules. It took them 4 summers. My husband maintained them for 30 years. She stopped. Her voice was perfectly controlled. No. Then we need to move faster than I planned, Mara said. If Forsyth responds to my letter and can get here within the month, what can we do before that? Clara asked. We can make sure that when Vane's offer arrives, you have documented grounds to challenge both the offer and the loan foreclosure simultaneously. If I can show that the loan itself was obtained under fraudulent conditions, that the debt was created by deliberate overcharging designed to manufacture a financial crisis, then the foreclosure action falls apart. Mara paused. I need 2 more things. I need the original supply contract you signed with Vane Supply, the one from when you first started using them. And I need the original loan documents from First Territory Bank. Clara looked at her steadily. I have those, I know you do. That's why I'm here. They went inside. Clara lit more lamps, and Mara spent the next 2 hours at the Prescott kitchen table, with the founding contract of the supply arrangement, and the full loan documentation spread in front of her. The cook brought coffee without being asked, and then made herself scarce, which was the right instinct. What Mara found in those documents was the piece she'd been missing. The original supply contract had a pricing clause, a standard-looking clause, about market rate adjustments that was written in language specific enough to look legitimate and vague enough to mean almost anything. The kind of language a careful lawyer writes when he wants to create an appearance of fairness while leaving room for whatever his client actually intends to do. She'd seen language like this before in Kansas City in a supplier fraud case that had taken 14 months to litigate. She knew exactly what it was built for. The loan documents were worse. Buried in the terms in the kind of paragraph that people sign without reading, because it's on page 8 of 11, and the language is deliberately technical was a clause that linked the loan's principal repayment schedule to the borrower's ongoing use of approved county suppliers, of which Vane Supply was listed as the primary. If Clara had stopped using Vane Supply, the loan would have been callable immediately. She had been trapped from two directions at once, and the trap had been set before she ever signed either document. Mara set both contracts on the table in front of Clara and Ethan and pointed to the relevant clauses without speaking. Clara read them, then she read them again. Then she said, very quietly, "He wrote this before I ever shook his hand." "The contract language was prepared in advance," Mara said, "which means he identified your property, researched your operation, determined what he wanted, and then constructed the mechanism to get it before he ever made a social call to this ranch." The three of them sat with that for a moment. Ethan said, "How many other ranches have the same clauses?" Mara had already checked. 4 out of the 6 I've reviewed. "Yours isn't one of them. Your contract predates this version." Lila Hatch's doesn't have it either, I think, because he knew she'd be less financially stable, and he didn't need the extra mechanism. But the Fenns and Tom Calder both have it. Then he has leverage over half the county that we haven't even started talking about, Ethan said. "Yes," Mar said, "which is why I need foresight here before Vane understands how much we know." 3 days later, Caleb Mercer came back. Not to the coal ranch this time, to the Langford Hotel, where he left a folded envelope at the desk addressed to Mara Bennett. Ruth held it until Mara came in that afternoon for coffee, as she'd taken to doing a few times a week, and handed it to her without comment beyond a questioning look that Mara answered with a small shrug that meant she didn't know yet either. She opened it at Ruth's kitchen table. It was 4 pages, handwritten in Caleb's careful script. It laid out, in sequence, everything Vane had asked him to do: the initial contact with Mara in Missouri, the 8 months of correspondence, the instruction to bring her to Black Ridge under the pretense of a future together, the deliberate abandonment at the station designed to leave her stranded and discredited before she'd spoken to anyone. It named dates, it named Britt, the legal agent, as the man who had relayed Vane's instructions. It described a meeting, 18 months prior, in which Vane had told Caleb specifically that a woman who had helped document supplier fraud in Kansas City was a liability if she ended up examining accounts in this county, and that the best way to neutralize a liability was to deliver her to the situation before she could choose it. He had not just brought her to Black Ridge. He had been sent to bring her to Black Ridge as a controlled variable, someone Vane knew, someone whose background he'd researched, placed in conditions he'd designed, so that if she ever did notice something wrong, she'd be dismissed as a woman with a personal grievance against a man who had abandoned her. Mara read it twice. She set it down on Ruth's kitchen table and looked at the middle distance for a moment that was longer than she intended. Ruth, who had been sitting across from her, said nothing. She waited. "He knew about the Kansas City case," Mara said finally. "He researched me. Before he ever contacted me, before the first letter, he researched my professional history and decided I was a threat to what he was building here. And then he had Caleb bring me here under conditions designed to make me look unstable." Ruth's expression was very still. "He's afraid of you." Mara looked at her. "A man who does all that," Ruth said, "is afraid of exactly what you can do. He went to considerable trouble. That tells you something." Mara folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. She held the envelope in both hands for a moment, feeling the paper. "I need to talk to all of them," she said. "Ethan, Claire, the Fenns, Tom Calder, Lila Hatch, everyone we've been working with. Together." Ruth nodded. "I can arrange it here, evening, when the hotel's quiet. I'll tell the boarders dinner is delayed." The meeting happened 2 nights later, in the Langford Hotel's small dining room, with the front door locked and the lamps turned to half. 7 people around a table that was built for 6, with Mara standing at one end and Ruth at the other, and 5 ranchers between them, who ranged in expression from grim to barely contained fury. Clara Prescott sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her. Tom Calder had his hat off and his eyes down, which Mara had learned was what he did when he was thinking hard. Lila Hatch was watching Mara with the particular attention of a woman who has been angry for a long time and is trying to decide if she's finally found somewhere useful to put it. The Fenn brothers, Garrett and James, sat together as they always did, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Mara laid it out. All of it, start to finish. The inflated prices, the engineered debt, the supply contract clauses, the linked loan terms, the coordinated timeline, Caleb's statement. She put them on paper where everyone could see them, the individual totals for each property, the aggregate, the loan amounts, the dates. She explained the water rights and what controlling the Prescott land would mean for every other operation in the county. She explained what Vane was planning and when. She didn't soften any of it. She had learned in Kansas City that the truth has a physical weight, and people need to feel that weight before they'll act on it. When she was done, the room was very quiet. Garrett Fenn said 8 years. I've been a customer of Vane Supply for 8 years. The heavy overcharging started 18 months ago, Marsa said. Before that, his prices were reasonable. You wouldn't have noticed. I should have checked, Garrett said, not to her, to himself or to his brother. He counted on you not checking, Mara said. It's a different thing, Lila Hatch said. What do? We wait for foresight, Mara said. And we do not make any moves that tip Vane off to how much we know. If he thinks we're still only looking at individual property accounts, he'll focus on the Prescott offer as his next move. If he realizes we have the full picture of the contract clauses, Caleb's statement, the aggregate fraud, he'll start hiding things. Moving documents, calling in favors, pressuring the local judge to act first. She looked around the table. Every one of us needs to go on, acting as if nothing has changed. You pay your Vane Supply invoices on time. You don't discuss this outside this room. If anyone asks you anything about your accounts or your business, you say things are fine. Tom Calder looked up from the table. And if Vane makes his move on the Prescott place before Forsythe gets here? Then we respond, Mara said. But with what we have, not before. Clara said. What if Forsythe doesn't come? He'll come, Ruth said from the far end of the table, with the certainty of a woman who has done her research on a man before trusting him. Mara looked at Clara. If there's any delay, we file what we have with the Territory Land Office and the Federal Circuit Court simultaneously, without going through the local court at all. It takes longer that way, but it bypasses Vane's local arrangements. You've thought about all the ways this could go wrong, Clara said. Not accusatory. Observational, yes, Mara said, that's what I do. Clara nodded once. It was from a woman like Clara Prescott, the equivalent of a full endorsement. They stayed another hour, going over specifics, who would carry documents for safekeeping outside their own properties, where the copies of the records were stored, how they would communicate without going through the Black Ridge post office. It was the kind of planning that felt both necessary and strange, the planning of ordinary people who had found themselves in a situation that required them to act like something other than ordinary people. When they were done, Lila Hatch stopped beside Mara near the door and said quietly, so that only Mara could hear, Henry never trusted Vane. He said so more than once. I thought he was just how men are sometimes about other men. Territorial. She paused. He was right, and I told him he was being paranoid. Mara looked at her. He was right, she said. That's what matters now. Lila left. The others followed in ones and twos until it was just Mara and Ruth clearing the table. Ruth said, You should sleep. You look like you haven't slept in 3 days. Mara said. That's not much better. Mara stacked the glasses and picked up the lamp. Do you ever feel like you've been carrying something for so long that putting it down seems more frightening than keeping it? Ruth considered this seriously. Yes, she said, after my husband died. I kept running the hotel the same way we always had, even the things that didn't make sense anymore, because changing them felt like admitting things had changed. She paused. Then one morning I rearranged the whole front desk, changed the breakfast menu, and hired a new cook. And it was fine, it was better. But it took me a year to get to that morning. Mara looked at her. What I'm saying, Ruth said, is that you don't have to carry all of it at once. Just carry today's portion. Mara thought about that. She thought about the letter, still in her coat pocket, Caleb's 4 pages of carefully written confession, which was both a weapon and a kind of ruin, because it confirmed the things she'd already known, but had still hoped, in some unexamined corner of herself, might not be entirely true. I'll sleep, she said. She almost managed it. Forsythe's reply came 12 days after Tom had carried the letter north. It arrived via a private courier, not the post, which was itself a message. A man careful enough to respond to a fraud investigation by not using the county's compromised mail system was a man who understood what he was dealing with. The letter was brief. He would be in Black Ridge within 10 days. He had reviewed the summary she'd provided and wished to examine the original documents. He would need affidavits from each of the affected property owners. He said one more thing. At the end of the letter, which Mara read, and then read again, he said that the pattern she'd described matched a method he had been investigating in 2 other territories without yet having the specific documentation necessary for a federal case, and that if her evidence was as she'd described it, the implications extended considerably beyond Black Ridge. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to tell Ethan. He was in the barn, doing something with a harness that wasn't cooperating. And he looked up when she came in and read her expression before she said anything. Which she was learning was a habit of his not assuming, just paying attention. She held out the letter. He read it. He read it again. Then he set the harness down on the workbench and looked at her. He's coming, Ethan said. He's coming, she said. Something passed through his face. Relief, she thought, though with Ethan it was always slightly complicated. Relief layered over the steadiness he carried as a default. He handed the letter back and said, What do we need to do before he gets here? Affidavits from everyone. I'll draft the language they just need to sign in front of a witness. I want certified copies of all the invoices and contracts. And I want Caleb's statement in a form Forsyte can use. She folded the letter. There's also something else. He waited. I need to go back through Vane's public business filings, she said. The ones registered with the county recorder's office. I haven't looked at those yet. I've been working from the private side. But if the contract language I found in Clara's documents came from a deliberate legal strategy, there may be a template, something that shows the same language used across multiple counties. If this is a method, the way Forsyte is suggesting, then the business structure he built here wasn't invented for Black Ridge. He brought it with him. Can you get to the county recorder's office without Vane knowing? Not through the front door, she said. But Ruth has a cousin who works there. Ethan looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled. Not a large smile, nothing demonstrative. Just the quiet expression of a man who has been worried about something for a long time and has just, for the first time, started to believe it might be all right. You think of everything, he said. I think of most things, she said. That's different. She turned to go. He said her name. She stopped and looked back. Whatever happens when Forsyte gets here, Ethan said carefully, like a man choosing words he's thought about. What you've built here, what you've done for this county, for these families, I don't know that any of them know how to say what it means yet. I'm not sure I do either, he paused. But I know it. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about $4.32. She thought about a platform in the wind and an empty street and the particular quality of being stranded in a place you didn't choose. 10 days, she said. Let's not waste them. She walked back to the house. Behind her, she could hear him pick up the harness again, steady and without drama, the sound of a man who had decided what he was committed to and was getting on with it. Somewhere on the other side of Black Ridge, Silas Vane was making his plans for the Prescott Ranch, confident in the machinery he'd spent years building and the people he'd placed in position and the quiet arrangements he'd made with the right judges and the right officials and the one woman he'd had, delivered to his county like a problem he'd already solved. He had no idea what was coming. Mara Bennett walked into Ethan Cole's study, sat down at the desk, pulled out a fresh page, and began to draft the language for 6 affidavits that would take Silas Vane's machinery apart piece by piece. She worked until the lamp burned down. Then she trimmed the wick, refilled the oil, and kept going. Gerald Forsyte arrived on a Wednesday 8 days after his letter, which was 2 days earlier than he'd said, and Mara took that as a sign that he'd read her summary more carefully than his brief reply had suggested. He came in on the stage from the north, not the train from the east, and he came without announcing himself, which was either professional caution or personal habit. She wasn't sure which yet. Ruth's cousin at the county recorder's office had sent word the morning before that a man matching Forsyte's description had been making inquiries about public filings in the next county over, which meant he'd been doing his own groundwork before he ever set foot in Black Ridge, which meant he was the kind of man who verified before he committed. She was glad of that. She needed someone not be easily impressed or easily rattled. He was not what she'd pictured. She'd pictured someone older, heavier, with the look of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms and carried the weariness of it. Gerald Forsyte was perhaps 45, lean in the way of someone who traveled constantly and ate irregularly, with sharp gray eyes behind plain wire spectacles and the particular quality of stillness in his bearing that she associated with people who had learned to read rooms before they walked into them. He was carrying a leather case that was visibly heavy and showed years of hard use. And he looked at Black Ridge the way she imagined she had looked at it when she stepped off the train taking stock, reserving judgment. Ruth brought him to the hotel's back sitting room, where Mara and Ethan were already waiting, and introduced them with the directness that was becoming familiar. Gerald Forsyte, Mara Bennett, and then she sat down herself, because Ruth Cahill had decided somewhere in the past several weeks that this was her business too, and she was not going to be managed out of the room. Forsyte sat across from Mara and opened his leather case and took out a notepad and said, "Without preamble, your letter was the most organized description of a supplier fraud scheme I've received from a non-attorney. Tell me how you built it." So she told him. She took him through it the same way she'd taken Ethan through it that first evening in the study, methodically, from the beginning, with the numbers in the order that told the story most clearly. She had her notebook, her copies, the sorted invoices, the contract documents, Caleb's written statement. She'd spent the previous 2 days organizing everything into a sequence that a stranger could follow without needing her to explain context he didn't have. He listened without interrupting for 40 minutes. He made notes. He occasionally looked down at the documents she placed in front of him and occasionally looked back up at her with the expression of someone calibrating the gap between what they expected and what they're getting. It wasn't condescension, more like the adjustment a careful person makes when a situation turns out to be more serious than the version they'd prepared for. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He set down his pencil and looked at the organized stacks of documents on the table between them. "The county recorder's office filings," he said. She slid a separate folder across the table. "I had access to them through a contact. The supply contract template appears in 3 other counties, under slightly different company names: Vane Regional Supply in the Harmon Territory, Northern Territorial Provisions in the Garrick District. Same pricing clause language, same linked loan structure, different names, same architect." Forsythe opened the folder and looked at the documents inside. His expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted in the set of his jaw, the quiet shift of a man who has been working towards something for a long time and has just been handed the piece he was missing. "I've been looking at the Harmon Territory case for 14 months, he said. He said it almost to himself. Not quite to her, I know. Mara said, "Your name was on the public filing from the Harmon investigation. That's partly why I wrote to you specifically." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You researched me before you contacted me. I couldn't afford to contact the wrong person," she said. "Vane has arrangements with the local judiciary and at least 2 council members. I needed someone he couldn't reach." "He may try to reach me," Forsythe said. "He may. But by the time he knows you're here, I'd like to be past the point where that does him any good." Forsythe looked at her for a moment, then at Ethan, then back at Mara. "The affidavits," he said. "Ready for signature. 6 property owners. I drafted the language, but I'd like you to review it before anyone signs." He held out his hand. She placed the drafted affidavits in it. He read through them with the focused attention of a man who reads everything. Not the cursory skim of someone looking for keywords, but the real reading. The kind where you go back and reread a sentence when something in it catches. When he was done, he made 4 small notations in the margins and handed them back. "Change those 4 places," he said, "otherwise the language is sound. You've been precise about what you're asserting and what you're not, which is more than I can say for half the attorneys who file cases in my circuit." Mara took the affidavits back. "I'll have the corrected versions ready tomorrow morning. I'll need to interview each of the property owners separately," he said, "and I want to see the original ledgers, not just your copies. I can arrange that. 3 of the ranchers can come here. The Prescott Ranch and the Hatch property, you'll need to go to them. They won't want to leave their land right now." "Understood." He closed his notepad, the Mercer statement. She handed him Caleb's letter. He read it more slowly than he'd read anything else, which told her something about what he was thinking. When he set it down, he said, "Is he prepared to provide a formal affidavit?" "I believe so." He indicated willingness. "But I haven't had direct contact with him since he left the letter at the hotel. I'll need to speak with him directly." He paused. "He understands what providing a formal statement means. He'll be named as a party to the scheme. There may be consequences for him as well." "I made that clear to him," Mara said. "He made his choice." Forsythe nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information. He looked at the table, at the organized documentation, at the notebook with its 63 pages of careful figures. Then he said, "How long were you an accountant?" 8 years. "Why did you leave Kansas City?" She looked at him steadily. "You mean, why did I end up here?" "Yes," she told him. Not everything. She wasn't in the habit of telling everything to people she'd known for less than 2 hours, but enough. Enough for him to understand the shape of it. The letters, the platform, the $4.32. The hotel route, Ethan's ledgers, the third pile labeled questionable. He listened with the same focused attention he gave to documents. When she was done, he said, "He miscalculated." "Significantly," she said. Ruth made coffee, and there was a brief necessary pause in the professional conversation where people drank it and the tension in the room let out slightly. And Ethan, who had been quiet through most of the meeting with the patience he brought to everything, asked Forsythe about the Harmon Territory case and got a 20-minute answer that was more candid than Mara expected from a federal attorney talking to people he'd met an hour ago. She decided that was its own kind of signal. Forsythe was not the kind of man who performed caution. He was direct because directness was, in his experience, more efficient than the alternatives. The corrected affidavits went out the next day. By the following afternoon, Mara had ridden to each of the 6 properties and returned with 5 signed documents. The 6 Tom Calder's took an extra day, because Tom wanted to read every word 3 times before he touched a pen to it, and she didn't rush him. He signed on Friday morning with a hand that was perfectly steady, which told her more about him than he probably realized. Caleb Mercer agreed to meet with Forsythe on Saturday, at the Langford Hotel, in a room Ruth set aside for the purpose. Mara was not in the room for that conversation. She'd asked Forsythe whether she should be, and he'd said no. That witnesses tended to give more complete statements when they weren't being watched by someone they'd wronged. She understood the logic and accepted it, which didn't mean waiting in the hotel lobby for 2 hours was easy. Ruth sat with her. She brought a deck of cards and they played a simple two-person game that neither of them paid much attention to while the minutes moved. At one point, Ruth said, without looking up from her cards, "Whatever he says in there doesn't change what you built." Mara set down a card. "I know. Sometimes it matters to hear it said." "It does," Mara said. "Thank you." Forsythe came out of the room 2 hours and 10 minutes after he'd gone in. He closed the door behind him, looked at Mara, and said he gave a complete statement. More complete than I expected. He named dates, locations, specific instructions. He also named a third party I hadn't heard of yet, a man called Dyer, who appears to operate as Vane's intermediary with the banking arrangement. He paused. "That expands the scope of the federal action." "How significantly?" Mara asked. "Enough that I want to move faster than I planned," he said. "If Dyer is the banking connection, he'll have records we haven't seen yet, records that could be moved or destroyed if Vane gets any indication of what's coming." "When?" Mara asked. "I need to send for Judge Everett Harding," Forsythe said. "He handles federal land and commercial fraud cases in this circuit. I want a preservation order, something that prevents any documents or records from being removed from Vane's office or the bank premises before we can examine them. For that, I need Harding." "How long?" "A week, perhaps 10 days to get word to him and have him travel here." He looked at her steadily. "Can we hold the Prescott situation for that long?" Mara thought about it. Clara's loan deadline. Vane's offer, which had not yet formally arrived, but which Caleb had said was coming within the week. "I'll need to advise Clara to stall if the offer comes in before Harding arrives," she said. "Tell Vane she's considering it, that she needs time. He'll believe it. He's built the whole scheme on the assumption that people in this county don't have anywhere else to turn." "He'd be wrong," Ruth said. "Yes," Mara said, "he would." The offer came in on Monday. It arrived at the Prescott Ranch by way of a man named Fletcher, who worked for Britt, Vane's legal agent, and who had the unfortunate quality of looking comfortable delivering bad news, which told you something about the kind of work he was accustomed to. He presented Clara with a formal written offer for the Prescott property, at a figure that was, when Mara looked at it that evening, approximately 40% of what the land was worth based on comparable sales she'd found in the county recorder's records. Clara had looked at the offer for a long moment, set it on her kitchen table, and said to Fletcher, "Tell Mr. Vane's I'll consider it." Fletcher had looked mildly surprised. He'd expected more resistance, Mara thought, or more desperation, one or the other. "There's a deadline," he said. "Mr. Vane needs a response within 14 days. "You'll have one," Clara said. He left. Clara watched him ride out, then turned to Mara, who'd been in the sitting room during the exchange and came through when she heard the door. 14 days, Clara said. "Harding should be here within 10, Mara said. "If not, we file without him. And if we file without him, we lose some of the speed, but not the case." Mara picked up the offer, looked at it, set it back down. "He's undervaluing this land by 60%. That number alone, when it goes in front of a federal judge alongside the documentation of how he manufactured the debt that makes you appear unable to refuse, that number tells its own story." Clara looked at her for a moment. "You're not worried," she said. "Not quite a question. I'm very worried," Mara said. "I'm just not letting it run things." Clara almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing Mara had seen on her face in the weeks they'd been working together. Harding arrived on the 9th day. He arrived, like Forsythe, on the northern stage, and he arrived, unlike Forsythe, with absolutely no subtlety about who he was, a large man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most consequential person in whatever room he entered, and had no particular feelings about it either way. He wore a good coat and carried a single bag, and walked off the stage looking neither tired nor ruffled, which seemed physically improbable given the roads. He went straight to the Langford Hotel, where Forsythe had arranged for him to have the largest room available, which was Ruth's own room that she had vacated for the purpose and relocated to a small space at the back of the hotel without mentioning the inconvenience to anyone. Forsythe met with Harding that evening. Mara was not in that meeting either, which she had expected. What she had not expected was the knock on the door of the room Ruth had loaned her, a small rectangle at the end of the second-floor hall, at just past 9 that evening. She opened it to find Forsythe. "Judge Harding wants to speak with you tomorrow morning," he said. 7 o'clock here at the hotel. "All right," she said. He started to turn, then stopped. "He's read your documentation. He read it tonight. The whole of it." A pause. "He said to tell you it's the cleanest fraud case file he's seen in 20 years. Forsythe said this in the tone of someone relaying a fact, not paying a compliment. "I thought you should know before tomorrow." He left. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand on the frame. She went back to the desk in Ruth's small loaner room and looked at the notes she'd been working on for the morning, the sequence she planned to present, the order of documents, the points she anticipated being challenged on. and her prepared responses. She sat with them for a long time. Outside, Black Ridge was as quiet as it ever got. She thought about Silas Vane in his office on the north end of Main Street, which she'd walked past enough times by now to know exactly what it looked like from the outside, a substantial building, better built than most of what surrounded it, with his name on a brass plate by the door. She thought about the care he'd taken, the years of it, the deliberate construction of a system that was designed to be invisible, to look like nothing more than the ordinary friction of frontier economics, the way prices go up and debts accumulate and land changes hands, because that was just the way of things. She thought about what it had cost the people in this county, not just in money, though the money was real and the figures in her notebook were real, but in the quieter ways. Tom Calder blaming the weather for a bad season that hadn't been caused by weather. Lila Hatch telling a dead man he was paranoid. Clara Prescott sitting with a loan document at her kitchen table and thinking it was her own fault she hadn't read page 8 closely enough. She thought about the woman on the train platform who had stood in the wind and counted $4.32 and told herself she would not beg for pity. She closed her notebook. 7 o'clock came fast. Harding was already at the dining table when she came down, with a cup of coffee and Forsythe's copy of her documentation in front of him. He looked up when she sat down across from him and studied her for a moment with the frank appraisal of a man who had long since stopped caring about the social inconvenience of looking directly at people. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Judge Harding, Forsythe tells me you're not an attorney." "No. But you built this case." "I assembled the evidence," she said. "The ranchers built the case by letting themselves be defrauded on paper." He looked at her steadily. "That's an interesting distinction. It's an accurate one." He picked up the top document from the stack in front of him, the pricing analysis, the one she'd spent the most time on, the one that mapped the overcharge pattern across all 6 properties against market rates sourced from the county recorder's public commodity filings. "Walk me through this," he said. She walked him through it. He stopped her twice to ask questions, precise questions, the kind that cut directly to the assumptions underlying a calculation, and tested whether those assumptions were sound. She answered both, without hesitation, because she had tested those assumptions herself, weeks ago, and had the secondary sources to support them. He listened. He nodded twice. He wrote something on his notepad. Then he said, "The linked loan clause. You're asserting that the bank loans and the supply contracts were designed as a coordinated mechanism. That's a more serious claim than simple price fraud." "Yes," she said. "What evidence supports that assertion beyond the presence of the same clause in multiple contracts?" She placed 3 documents on the table in front of him. The contract preparation dates on file with the county recorder's office. The supply contract for the Prescott property was prepared and registered 6 weeks before Clara Prescott was approached as a customer of Vane Supply. The loan documents show a registered template date at First Territory Bank that predates all individual loan agreements by 8 months. Both the supply contract template and the loan template appear in the same legal filing bundle at the recorder's office, filed by the same agent on the same day. She paused. He built the trap before he found the people to put in it. Harding looked at the 3 documents. He looked at them for a long time. "Mercer's statement," he said, "corroborates the intent. He was explicitly told that the goal was land acquisition, specifically the Prescott property, and that the pricing and loan structure were designed to manufacture the conditions for foreclosure." Harding set down the documents and looked at her. "You understand that Vane will challenge everything. His attorneys will argue market rate fluctuation, voluntary contract signing, standard banking practice." "Yes," she said. "That's why I sourced every mark rate figure from public documents that predate my investigation. There's no argument that I manipulated the comparison figures because every source was registered before I arrived in this county." She paused. "I anticipated the challenges." "I can see that," he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stack of documentation. Then he said, "I'm going to issue a preservation order this afternoon. I'll have Forsythe draft the specific terms. The order will cover all documents, ledgers, contracts, and correspondence held by Vane Supply, First Territory Bank, and the agent Britt's office." He looked at her. "When the order is served, Vane will know exactly what's happening." "I know," she said. "He may attempt to move quickly on the Prescott offer, force a signature before the legal situation becomes clear." "Clara Prescott won't sign anything," Mara said. "I've spoken with her." Harding nodded. He gathered the documents in front of him back into their folder and set it to the side. He picked up his coffee cup, which must have been cold by now, and drank from it anyway. "One more question," he said. "Yes, you came here alone. No resources. No official standing. No legal authority." He was looking at her with something that wasn't quite curiosity, more like the interest of a person, looking at something they haven't seen before in a category they thought they knew well. "What made you keep going when it would have been considerably easier to stop?" She thought about it. The honest answer was not simple, but she owed him honesty because he'd given her his full attention, and that was worth something. I got to a point where I understood what he'd built, she said, the whole structure of it, and I thought about all the people who'd signed his contracts and believed his prices were just the cost of things and blamed themselves when the money ran short, and never knew there was a reason to look at the numbers differently. She paused. I know what it's like to be left somewhere with nothing, and told the situation is your own fault. I wasn't going to let him keep doing that, people on paper. Harding looked at her for a moment, then he set down his coffee cup and said, "The preservation order will be served at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I'd advise you to be at the coal ranch when that happens. Let the official process proceed without your visible involvement." "Understood," she said. She rode out to the coal ranch after breakfast, told Ethan what was coming, and then did something she almost never did in the middle of the day. She stopped working. She sat on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight and did nothing useful for about 40 minutes, which was as long as she could manage it. At 3:15, according to the account she got from Ruth the following morning, federal marshals served the preservation order simultaneously at Vane's office, at First Territory Bank, and at Britt's commercial office on the south end of Main Street. Vane had apparently been in his office when the marshals arrived. The clerk who worked the front desk told the story to 3 different people before sundown. Vane had looked at the preservation order, looked at the marshal, and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he'd said very quietly, "Who filed this?" The marshal had said it was a federal action and hadn't offered anything further. Vane had said, "I want my attorney." The marshal had said he was welcome to contact one. Then the marshals had taken possession of the filing room and the account ledgers and every cabinet and crate they could find, with an inventory clerk making a record of everything removed, while Vane stood in his own office and watched it happen to him. The bank president, a man named Holloway, who had apparently understood for some time that his controlling shareholders' business practices were not going to end well, but had convinced himself that not being the one holding things directly made him. Safe had sat down when the marshals arrived at the bank and had not gotten up again for a considerable time. The tellers stood in a row and watched the files being inventoried. Britt had not been in his office when the marshal arrived. He had not been found in Black Ridge at all that evening, which Mara filed under useful information when she heard it the next morning. What happened the following afternoon was the part nobody had predicted. The federal marshals, going through the material removed from Vane's office, found inside a false panel in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet that they opened with a set of skeleton keys, a personal ledger, handwritten by Vane himself in his own careful script, containing in detailed sequential entries going back 6 years, a complete record of the scheme payments to officials, to the bank president, to Britt, to a judge in the circuit court whose name appeared 17 times. Specific notations about each targeted property when it was first identified, what the water or mineral or land value was, what mechanism was chosen to acquire it. Specific payments in and out. Notes about timing. Notes about people. There was an entry about Mara Bennett. It was 2 lines long. It described her professional background and the Kansas City case, and it said, in Vane's handwriting, that she had been placed in Black Ridge under controlled conditions and was expected to surface and be neutralized by personal circumstance. Forsythe brought word to the coal ranch in person, arriving in the late afternoon, with the look of a man who has just seen something he expected and something he didn't, layered over each other. He told Mara about the ledger with the careful neutrality of someone relaying information rather than editorializing, and then he told her about the entry. She stood in Ethan's study and listened, and when Forsythe was done, she said, he kept records of all of it. Every transaction, Forsythe said, every payment, every contact. It appears he didn't trust anyone else to know the full picture, so he kept it himself. In writing, Ethan from the doorway said quietly, he didn't think anyone would ever find it. No, Forsythe said, he didn't. Mara thought about a man who was careful enough to build a scheme across 6 years and 3 territories, and hadn't anticipated that the woman he'd arranged to be left stranded at a train station would spend the next several weeks taking his operation apart from the inside. She thought about the particular kind of blind spot that comes from believing your arrangements are permanent. What happens now? She asked. Judge Harding will review everything tomorrow morning, Forsythe said. He'll issue further orders as warranted. Given the content of the ledger, he paused, choosing words. Given the content of the ledger, I expect this to expand significantly. The judge named in those pages is a federal appointment. That brings in another level of authority entirely. And Vane? He's been asked not to leave Black Ridge pending the court's review. He has not been formally charged yet, but that is a matter of procedure and timing, not of outcome. Forsythe looked at her directly. The evidence is overwhelming, Miss Bennett. What you assembled, combined with what was in that cabinet, There is no version of this that ends well for Silas Vane. She nodded. After Forsythe left, Ethan came into the study and stood across the desk from her, the way he'd stood that first evening when she'd spread the sorted invoices and told him what she'd found. The same desk, the same distance between them. Everything else entirely different. He said, "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly, which was a habit she didn't always apply to that question. She was tired in a way that had weight to it. She was also, underneath that, something she didn't have a clean word for, the feeling of having seen a thing through to its logical end, of having held a line she wasn't certain she could hold, and found that she had. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." He nodded, accepting that without pushing it further, which was something she had come to appreciate about him, more than she'd expected to, when she first sat down at his desk with a pile of overpriced invoices and a notebook full of questions. "I made sups," he said, "or Tom did, and I supervised, which may be worse. But it's there," she almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. "I'll be in a minute," he left. She sat alone in the study for a moment longer, her hands flat on the desk, looking at the clear surface of it, cleared now of the stacks and folders and notebooks that had covered it for weeks. All of that material currently in the hands of a federal marshal and a judge who would carry it forward from here. She had done what she came to do. She hadn't come to do it. She hadn't come here to do anything except survive a bad decision and find the next step. But she had done it. She got up, turned down the lamp, and went to have supper. The morning after the preservation order, Black Ridge woke up to something it hadn't felt in years, possibly ever, the particular suspended quality of a place that knows something has shifted but hasn't yet been told exactly what. People stood in front of the feed store and talked in lower voices than usual. The tellers at First Territory Bank came to work and found a federal marshal sitting in the lobby reading a newspaper with the calm of a man who had nowhere else to be. Vane's office on the north end of Main Street was locked, the brass plate on the door catching the morning light the same as always. But the curtains were drawn in a way they'd never been drawn before, and anyone who walked past could see the inventory stickers the marshals had left on the window frame. Mara rode into town that morning with Ethan, not because she needed to be there for anything official, but because Ruth had sent word that Forsythe wanted everyone gathered at the hotel by 9, and because staying at the ranch while things unfolded felt like a kind of cowardice she wasn't willing to practice. She'd slept 4 hours, maybe 5, and she knew it showed. She'd seen herself in the small mirror above the washstand and had made the practical decision to stop looking. Sleep could come later. There was too much that needed to be present for first. The dining room of the Langford Hotel was full in a way it had never been at 9 in the morning. Clara Prescott was there, sitting straight-backed at the far end of the table, with her hands folded in front of her, wearing the expression of a woman who has spent the night preparing herself for whatever the morning brought. The Fenn brothers sat together the way they always did, shoulders nearly touching. Tom Calder had ridden in from his place before sunrise. Based on the look of him, his coat still carried the cold of an early morning ride, and he hadn't taken it off. Leela Hatch was wearing her good dress, which Mara suspected was deliberate, a kind of personal formality for an occasion that warranted it. Ruth stood near the kitchen doorway with coffee already made, and an expression that said she'd been up longer than anyone. Forsythe was at the head of the table, and beside him was Judge Harding, who looked as unhurried as he had on every other occasion Mara had seen him, which she was beginning to understand was not composure, but constitution. The man was simply built at a slower metabolic rate than most people. Harding spoke first. He was not a man who built to things, he stated them. The preservation order was in full effect. Federal marshals had secured all records from Vane Supply, First Territory Bank, and the office of Agent Britt, who remained as yet unlocated, but who Harding described as a secondary matter that would be resolved in time. The ledger recovered from Vane's office had been authenticated overnight by Forsythe and 2 additional federal officers who had arrived that morning from the territory capital. Its contents were being formally entered into the federal record. Silas Vane had been placed under formal federal detention at 7 o'clock that morning, which meant he was currently in the custody of the federal marshals at the Black Ridge jailhouse, the local sheriff having been asked to vacate the premises for the duration, which the sheriff had done with a speed that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to give him an excuse. The room was very quiet through all of this. Then Harding said, "The ledger names a circuit court judge, a county official, and a banking officer in addition to the principals already identified. Those individuals will be addressed through the appropriate federal process, which is not this room's concern today." He paused and looked around the table. "What is this room's concern today is the matter of remedy for the affected properties." He laid out what Forsythe had drafted, the remediation framework, which addressed 3 things. First, the cancellation of the supply contract pricing overcharges and the return of documented overpayments to each affected property, calculated from Mara's figures and verified against the records now in federal custody. Second, the voiding of the linked loan clauses in all 6 supply contracts, which removed the mechanism that had tied operating costs to loan terms and made the debt inescapable. Third, and most significantly for Clara, the freezing of all foreclosure actions initiated by First Territory Bank under the period covered by the federal investigation, pending a full audit of the bank's loan portfolio for fraudulently originated debt. Clara said, very quietly, the foreclosure on my property. Frozen, Harding said. And based on the preliminary review of the bank's origination records, it is the court's expectation that the underlying loan will be found to have been established under fraudulent conditions, which would void it entirely. Clara said nothing for a moment. She looked at the table in front of her, at her own folded hands, at the grain of the wood beneath them. Then she said, my father dug those water channels by hand. She said it, the way she'd said it that night on her porch in the dark, not to anyone in particular, just to the air, or to herself, or to someone who wasn't in the room anymore. Him and 3 hired men and 2 mules. It took them 4 summers. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. The Fenn brothers received the news about their loan differently. Garrett with a long exhale and his elbows coming down hard on the table. James with his eyes on the ceiling for a moment before he brought them back down. Then the 2 of them looked at each other in that sidelong way they had, the way of people who have been through things together and don't need words for all of it. Tom Calder nodded twice slowly, and then asked Harding a precise question about the timeline for the repayment calculation, which was so completely a Tom Calder thing to do, that Mara felt something loosen in her chest, the particular relief of the familiar, showing up exactly where you expect it. Lila Hatch looked at Mara directly, across the table, with the focused regard of a woman who has been angry for a long time and is finally carefully setting some of it down. Is this over? She asked. Mara looked back at her. The federal process is just beginning, she said. But the part where he was doing it to you, yes. That part is over. Lila nodded. She reached up and touched the collar of her good dress, a small automatic gesture, and then put her hand back in her lap and looked at the table and took one long, slow breath that probably said more about the last 2 years of her life than any account she could have given. After Harding and Forsythe had finished, and the meeting had shifted into the scattered conversation that follows any significant event, people talking in pairs and threes, asking questions, absorbing, Ruth found Mara near the window and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. Outside, Main Street was doing what Main Street always did, which looked different this morning, and would keep looking different for a while. The wagon, the woman with the basket, the dog asleep in the sun, everything ordinary, everything adjusted. You should eat something, Ruth said finally. You've had coffee and nothing else since yesterday. I had supper last night. That was 12 hours ago. Mara allowed this was probably true. Ruth went to the kitchen and came back with a plate that she set on the windowsill beside Mara, with the manner of someone who is not going to argue about it. Mara ate standing at the window while the room gradually emptied around her. She watched people leave Tom Calder shaking Harding's hand with the careful formality of a man who gives that gesture its full weight. The Fenn brothers stopping to speak with Forsythe at the door. Clara walking out with a posture that was, Mara thought, marginally different from the posture she'd walked in with. Something eased. Something that had been held very tight for a very long time allowed now to be slightly less tight. Ethan came over when the room was mostly clear and stood beside her at the window. Clara wants to have people to the ranch this evening, he said. A meal. She asked me to invite you specifically. I'll be there, Mara said. She said to tell you it's not a celebration. That's the right call, Mara said. He nodded. They stood at the window together for a moment in the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. What happens to Vane? Ethan asked. Federal prosecution, she said. Forsythe said the Harmon Territory cases will be joined to this one, now that they have the ledger. It'll take time. These things always take time. She paused. He'll lose everything. The supply company, the bank interest, the properties he'd already acquired. The ledger is a complete record. There's nowhere to hide from your own handwriting. He kept it because he didn't think he'd need to hide, Ethan said. Yes, she finished the last of what was on the plate and set it back on the windowsill. Men like that always believe the thing they've built is permanent. They confuse the fact that no one has stopped them yet with the impossibility of being stopped. Ethan looked at her. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more clearly lately. Not recently developed, she thought, but recently allowed to be visible. The way things become visible when a person is no longer spending most of their energy managing a situation. I keep thinking about that first evening, he said, when you went through the invoices and sorted them into 3 piles. The third pile was the largest, she said. I remember. He paused. I think I knew even then that something was wrong. I'd known for months, maybe longer. But I kept telling myself it was just the way things were. That prices go up and land is hard, and that's what life out here means. It's easier, she said. When you can't see who's doing it, it's easier to call it circumstance. Is that why you kept going? Because you could see who it was? She thought about it honestly. Partly, and partly because she stopped, considering how to say something true without making it sound like more than it was. When I got here, I had nothing. That's not self-pity, it's just the fact. $4. A broken suitcase, a story that made me look foolish. And the only thing I had that was worth anything was knowing how to read numbers and knowing what they meant. She looked out at the street. I wasn't going to let that be the thing he used against me. If he brought me here because he was afraid of what I could see, I was going to see it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was afraid of you before you even arrived, he said. And he still underestimated you. They always underestimate the thing they've already decided isn't a threat, she said. It's the same blind spot every time. They left the hotel together and walked out into the Thursday morning of Black Ridge, which was still adjusting to what had happened to it, and which would be adjusting for some time yet, because the kind of thing that had happened here doesn't resolve itself neatly at the moment of exposure. It resolves in stages, in weeks of paperwork and court filings and audit reports, in the slow untangling of what had been knotted for years, in the gradual recalibration of what people owed and what they were owed. That untangling had already begun. Mara could feel it the way you feel the change in air pressure before weather arrives, not visible yet, but present, working its way through. The dinner at the Prescott Ranch that evening was not a celebration, as Clara had specified, but it was the kind of meal that functions as something a community does when it needs to be in the same room together after a hard thing has finally passed. Clara cooked herself, which Mara hadn't expected. She'd assumed there would be a cook involved. But Clara was in the kitchen when they arrived, and the kitchen smelled like something that had been on the stove all day, and the windows were fogged with it. Ruth was there, and the Fenns, and Lila Hatch, and Tom Calder, and two neighboring families who hadn't been part of the fraud case, but who were the kind of neighbors who belonged in the room anyway, and Ethan, and Mara. They ate at the long table in Clara's dining room, which was a room that showed its age in a comfortable way. The table had been in the family for 2 generations. You could tell it by the wear pattern on the surface and the way the chairs didn't all match, and clearly never had. The conversation had the particular quality of people who have been through something together and are still sorting out how to talk about it now that the immediate crisis has passed. There were moments of unexpected humor, breaking through in places nobody planned for them. Garrett Fenn said something about his brother's record-keeping that made the whole table laugh. Tom Calder, who almost never told stories, told one about a supply delivery that had arrived 3 months late and included materials for an entirely different ranch, which turned out to be funnier in retrospect than it had been at the time. Clara sat at the head of her table and listened to all of it, with the look of a woman, allowing herself to be present in a way she hadn't been able to be for a long while. At some point, Mara looked around the table and understood something she hadn't quite articulated before. This was what Vane had been trying to prevent. Not just the federal case, not just the exposure of the ledger. This, specifically this, the particular thing that happens when people who have been isolated by design find their way back to the same room. He'd built his scheme on the assumption that they would each remain alone with their own numbers, each convinced that their situation was private and personal and probably their own fault. He had not accounted for what happens when someone sits down and shows them all the same picture at the same time. She didn't say this out loud. It wasn't the moment for that, but she held it. Ruth, sitting beside her, said quietly, "You're thinking something." "I'm often thinking something. You get a particular look," Ruth said, "like you're reading a ledger that nobody else can see." "I was thinking about what he missed," Mara said. "About what he didn't account for." "People," Ruth said simply. "Yes." Ruth went back to her plate. That was the thing about Ruth. She had the ability to say something complete and then let it be complete, without needing to build on it, or explain it, or return to it later. Mara had come to value that quality more than she could easily articulate. The evening wound down slowly. Tom Calder shook Clara's hand at the door and said, "Good table, Clara," which from Tom Calder was an extensive compliment. Clara accepted it without making anything of it. When most of the others had gone and it was just Mara and Ethan remaining, Clara walked them to the door and stopped before opening it. She looked at Mara with the direct, unsentimental regard that was simply how Clara Prescott looked at things she meant. "I want to say something," Clara said, "and I'm not going to dress it up." "All right," Mara said. "What you did, what you built, what you put together, that was the thing that saved this ranch. Not just mine, all of them. But mine especially, because mine was the target." She paused. The lamp behind her made a warm shape around the two of them. "I don't know how to thank a person for something that large. I've been thinking about it for weeks and I don't. So I'm just going to say I know it, and I won't forget it." Mara looked at her for a moment. Several things moved through her mind. She settled on the truth, which was simpler than any of them. You didn't fold when he expected you to, she said. You gave me 14 days and you didn't waver once. That mattered as much as the paperwork. Clara held her gaze. Then she opened the door. Good night, Mara. Good night, Clara. Riding back to the coal ranch in the dark, Mara and Ethan were quiet through most of it, not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that comes from being tired in the same direction. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were the kind of stars you only see on flat land where nothing interrupts the horizon, which she had stopped finding disorienting sometime in the past several weeks and started finding, if not beautiful exactly, then right in the way that things are right when they match their function. Ethan broke the quiet first. Are you going to go back to Kansas City? She'd expected the question. She'd been turning it over in her own mind for several days, not because the answer wasn't forming, but because she wanted to understand what it was forming into before she said it. I don't know, she said, which was honest. What would you go back to? He asked. Not pressuring, genuinely asking. The firm where I worked before doesn't exist anymore, she said. The owner retired and sold to someone who brought his own people. I'd need to find new work, start over, a pause I've started over before. I'm reasonably good at it. You are, he said. You're exceptionally good at it. He paused. But I'm going to ask you something directly because I think you'd rather that. I would, she said. I don't want you to go, he said. Not because the accounts need managing, though they do. Not because it's convenient to have someone who can read a supply contract. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving her room. Because in the past 2 months I've watched you do something I've never seen anyone do, and I've been around capable people my whole life. You walked into a situation with nothing, and you built something out of it that protected an entire county of people. And you did it while being exactly who you are, not performing competence, just having it. Not pretending the situation wasn't hard, just moving through it anyway. He paused. Like you to stay, on your own terms. Whatever those are. The wagon moved through the dark. The horses were comfortable on this road by now, and needed very little direction. She thought about $4.32. She thought about the platform in the wind. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing, and find that the nothing was, in a sense, the most honest position she'd ever been in, stripped of the pretense of a future that had never been real, free to build something that was actually hers. I'd need to be useful, she said. Not as a housekeeper. Not as someone you've taken in. Real work. The county's going to need someone to review every supply contract that touches these ranches. For the next several years, he said. Forsythe said as much this morning. The federal audit will take time. And during that time, someone needs to be watching the accounts the way you've been watching them. Someone the ranchers trust. He paused. They trust you. She thought about Tom Calder reading the affidavit 3 times before signing it, and then signing it with a steady hand. She thought about Lila Hatch in her good dress, asking if it was over. She thought about Garrett Fenn's long exhale, and the way his brother had looked at the ceiling, and then brought his eyes back down. That's real work, she said. It is, he confirmed. It would need to be compensated properly. I'm not asking you to stay out of some notion that you owe me something for the room and the desk. You don't owe me anything. I know I don't, she said, which came out more directly than she'd intended. And then, because it was true, she added, you know that I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I stayed because the work needed doing. I want to make sure we're both clear that whatever comes after that is a different decision. I'm clear on that, he said. Then yes, she said. I'll stay. He didn't say anything immediately. What she got was quieter than she expected, just the slight adjustment of his posture on the seat beside her. The way a person adjusts when something they've been holding carefully is allowed to settle into the right place. All right, he said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from the one they'd started with. In the weeks that followed, the federal case moved in the way federal cases move slowly on the surface, with enormous activity underneath. Forsythe returned to the territory capital with the full documentation, and Vane's ledger, the latter under guard, and began the process of building the prosecution. Vane remained in federal custody, his attorneys making noise about procedural irregularities that Harding addressed with the patience of a man who has heard every such argument possible and stopped being impressed by any of them decades ago. Britt was located eventually in a town 2 counties west and was transported back. The circuit court judge named in the ledger resigned his appointment before the federal inquiry formally reached him, which was the kind of move that confirms guilt without requiring a proceeding. Bank President Holloway cooperated fully, in the manner of men who understand that their choices at that point are cooperation or something considerably worse. The federal audit confirmed what Mara's documentation had predicted, and then exceeded it. The linked loan structure had been applied across 11 properties, not 6, and the total overpayments, when calculated against the full scope of Vane's operation, exceeded $110,000 across the relevant period. Restitution proceedings were initiated against Vane's personal assets and the frozen accounts of Vane Supply. First Territory Bank was placed under federal oversight with new management installed within 30 days. 4 months after the preservation order, the first restitution payments reached the affected ranchers. The amounts were not everything they never are, because fraud cases rarely return every dollar taken, and administrative costs carve into the recoverable sum. But they were substantial. Clara Prescott's loan was voided entirely, as Harding had predicted, and the Prescott land and water rights remained exactly where they had been for 2 generations. She put the restitution money into a water infrastructure improvement she'd been thinking about for years, and had told herself she'd never be able to afford. Mara found out about this from Ruth, who found out from Clara's cook, which was how most information moved in Black Ridge and always had been. Tom Calder paid off half his existing debt and set the rest aside against a bad season, because that was how Tom Calder thought about money in terms of what could still go wrong, which was not pessimism but experience. The Fenn brothers pooled their restitution with a small loan from the newly restructured bank and bought an adjacent parcel they'd been looking at for years, which nobody had predicted, and which turned out to be exactly the right move for their operation. Lila Hatch hired 2 hands she'd been unable to afford since Henry died, and the following spring the Hatch property ran more cattle than it had in 4 years. She didn't say much about it to anyone, but the property showed it. Mara knew these outcomes, not because anyone reported them to her, but because she was still doing the county's accounts work, reviewing contracts, examining new supplier agreements, auditing operating figures for the ranchers who wanted an outside eye. It was not dramatic work, most of it. It was the slow, careful, necessary work of making sure the ground stayed solid underfoot, which was different from the work of uncovering what had been done to make it unstable and required different qualities. Less urgency, more patience. She was suited to both, she found, which was something she hadn't known about herself before Black Ridge. Ruth Cahill closed the hotel every Sunday afternoon and had people to her sitting room for coffee in the way that older women who run establishments sometimes do, not formally, just an open door and a pot on, and whoever showed up. Mara went regularly, partly for the coffee, and partly because Ruth was the kind of company that made you think more clearly than you did before you arrived. One Sunday afternoon in late winter, several months after the last of the formal federal proceedings had wrapped, Vane had pleaded to the federal charges in a proceeding that lasted less than an afternoon, there being nowhere to argue when your own handwriting constitutes the primary evidence against you. Ruth's sitting room contained Ruth, Mara, and Ruth's young niece June, a girl of 17 who had come to stay for the winter, while her parents managed a land matter in another county. June had been listening to the afternoon's conversation with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something larger than what she'd been told directly. She was a serious girl, which Ruth had mentioned once without any indication of whether she thought this was an advantage or a liability, which itself told you something about Ruth. At some point June said to Mara, "Is it true you figured out the whole thing yourself? Just by looking at numbers?" "The numbers showed the pattern," Mara said. "But knowing what to look for takes practice, and being willing to keep looking when what you find makes things complicated, that takes something else." "What does it take?" June asked. She asked it the way people ask things when they actually want to know, not making conversation. Mara thought about it. She thought about the platform, the wind, the $4.32, the third pile of invoices labeled questionable that had turned out to contain everything that mattered. She thought about the night she'd sat alone at the desk, understanding that she'd been brought here, deliberately, as a controlled variable in someone else's scheme, and choosing to stay anyway and make something out of it that he hadn't planned for. "It takes deciding," she said, "that the fact that someone underestimated you is their problem and not yours." June looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth. Ruth was looking at Mara with the particular expression she wore when something landed exactly right, not surprise. Because Ruth rarely looked surprised, but recognition. "I want to learn accounting," June said. "Will you teach me?" Mara looked at her, this girl in Ruth's sitting room with her serious face, and her winter coat, and her entire future spread in front of her like a ledger, with all the columns still empty, and everything still possible. "Yes," she said, "come to the coal ranch on Wednesday. Bring something to write with." June came on Wednesday, and the Wednesday after, and for most Wednesdays through the remainder of that winter. She was quick in the particular way of people who have always understood numbers but have never been shown how to make them useful. She grasped the underlying logic before she grasped the method, which was the best possible arrangement because method could be taught and logic mostly couldn't. By spring she was doing basic reconciliation work for 2 of the smaller properties near Black Ridge, whose owners were glad to have someone capable and glad to pay for it. She was not as fast as Mara yet and made the particular errors that beginners make, which are always errors of assumption rather than calculation. Mara corrected them, without making them into occasions, which was how she'd been taught, and which she suspected was the only way correction actually worked. Caleb Mercer left Black Ridge 2 weeks after the federal proceedings concluded. He left without coming to find Mara, which was the correct decision, and she knew it was the correct decision, and still spent one evening, just one, thinking about those 8 months of letters, what had been constructed, and what, if anything, had been real in them, and whether the two could be sorted the way she sorted invoices into piles. She decided eventually that the sorting wasn't possible and wasn't useful. He had done what he'd done. He had also, at some cost to himself, done what he'd done afterward. She could hold both of those things at once, without needing them to add up to a cleaner sum. Life rarely added up to a cleaner sum. That was not a flaw in the accounting. It was just the nature of the numbers. She didn't think about him often. The work and the days were full, and she had learned that fullness was not the same as avoidance. There was a difference between a life too busy to feel things, and a life full enough that the difficult feelings found their right proportion, which was small but not absent. The snow came in October with the decisiveness that flat country's weather always has, where there's nothing between the open sky and the land to slow anything down. The coal ranch handled it well. Ethan had spent August preparing for it, laying in provisions, and reinforcing the barn's north wall and checking every piece of equipment for the state it would be in when it was actually needed. He was a man who prepared for difficulty without catastrophizing it, which was its own kind of skill. She had come to rely on that quality, without always acknowledging that she did, which was perhaps the most honest measure of how much it mattered. The things you rely on without thinking about it are the things that have become genuinely part of your foundation. On a November evening, when the snow had been on the ground for 3 weeks, and the ranch was as settled into winter as it was going to get, Ethan came into the study where Mara was working and sat down across the desk from her, in the chair he always used, and didn't say anything immediately, which meant he was thinking about how to say something. She looked up. "What is it?" "I want to ask you something," he said. She set down her pencil. All right, he didn't look away from her the way he had on the road in the dark when he'd asked her to stay. He looked directly at her, which was his normal way, and the thing she'd come to recognize as a marker of when something mattered especially. "I know we said on your own terms," he said, "and those terms have been working. I know you're not here out of necessity anymore. You have the county work. You have what Forsyth's office has referred to you through the federal oversight. You have means now that you didn't have when you arrived. I know you could leave." "I know that too," she said. "I'm asking you to stay in a different way than I asked before," he said. "Not as someone who does the accounts and lives in the ranch house." He stopped. Ethan Cole, who generally finished his sentences, stopped. He started again. "I want to marry you, if you want that. I'm not asking because it makes the arrangement tidier or because it solves a problem. I'm asking because I want to. I've wanted to for a while, and I've been trying to figure out how to ask it in a way that doesn't sound like the rest of the things people say at the beginning of things that don't turn out." She looked at him across the desk, the same desk where she'd first sorted his invoices into 3 piles, and understood that something was very wrong with the numbers, where she'd spent nights assembling what would become a federal fraud case, where she now sat most days doing work that was genuinely hers, in a place that had become genuinely hers. "You're worried it sounds like Caleb's letters," she said. He didn't flinch from it. "Yes, it doesn't," she said. He was describing a future he'd manufactured. "You're asking about one we've already built." She paused. "That's a different thing entirely." He looked at her. The lamp between them was steady, no draft. Just the warm, ordinary light of an evening in a ranch house in November, with snow on the ground, and the hands in the bunkhouse, and everything quiet in the way that working land is quiet when the day's work is genuinely done. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers for a moment, not squeezing it, just placing it there, the way you place something you want to remain. Then he sat back and said with the quiet that was his natural register, "All right then." She almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh, but it was close enough that he saw it, and something in his face did the same thing in return. She picked up her pencil and looked back at her page, but she was smiling, which she could feel on her own face, slightly ridiculous and completely genuine, which was the best combination. "All right," she said. Spring came the way spring comes to flat country, not gently, not in the gradual warming of places with hills and trees to moderate it, but all at once, the snow giving way in a matter of days to mud, and then to the first green along the creek beds, and then to the wide, flat, uncompromising bloom of it all. The land going from one season to the next with the same decisiveness it did everything. It was too much at once, and it was entirely itself, which Mara had decided some months ago was something she was glad of. The wedding was in April, in the yard of the Langford Hotel, which was Ruth's doing without being attributed to Ruth. She had simply arranged things in the way she arranged most things, without announcement or credit, and the result was that the space was ready, and the people were there, and the afternoon was as good as an April afternoon in that country gets, which was genuinely good. Clara Prescott wore her good dress and stood near the front. Tom Calder came in his best hat and stood very straight for the whole of it. The Fenn brothers brought a bottle of something that proved, on tasting, to have been a considerably better purchase than their usual standard. Lila Hatch brought food and stood at the edge of things with the look of a woman who is glad to be included and not entirely sure she deserves to be, which Mara noticed and made a point of correcting by going over to her before anything began and saying simply, "I'm glad you're here," which Lila received with a brief nod and something that might have been, in other circumstances, the beginning of tears, though it resolved itself before it got there. June was there, standing beside Ruth in the manner of someone who is memorizing everything she sees because she understands it will matter later, though she couldn't yet have said exactly how. She had her notebook with her, which she'd started carrying everywhere as a habit developed out of the Wednesday sessions, and which Ruth had chosen not to comment on. Forsyth sent a letter since he was back in the territory capital. It was formal in language and warm in everything between the lines, which was very Forsyth, and Ruth read it aloud to the gathered people with a dryness in her delivery that made it funnier than Forsyth had probably intended. Ruth stood beside Mara before the proceedings began and looked her over in the direct appraising way that was simply how Ruth Cahill assessed any situation she cared about. "You look well," she said. "I feel well," Mara said, which is not something I would have said in October of last year. "No," Ruth agreed. "You looked like a woman carrying a building on her shoulders last October." "I was," Mara said. "It's lighter now." Ruth smiled. A full smile, not her usual restrained version. "Good," she said, and went to take her place. What Mara thought about, standing in the April yard of the Langford Hotel in Black Ridge, was not what she'd expected to think about. She didn't think about the platform, or the $4.32 or Caleb. She thought about the third pile. The invoices she'd sorted that first evening in Ethan's study, the ones she'd labeled questionable, because they didn't match what they should have been, because something was wrong with them that couldn't be explained away by any ordinary cause. The pile that had turned out to contain everything that mattered. She thought about how easy it would have been to put those invoices somewhere else. How reasonable it would have been to tell herself that prices go up, that's just the way of things, and close the ledger and move on. Most people did exactly that, not because they were foolish, because they were busy and tired, and the small wrong things are hard to see when you're too close to your own situation to see the whole pattern. And because being right about something being wrong means you now have to do something about it, which is an additional burden on a person who is already burdened. What she had always been able to do was see the pattern. What she had learned in the months between that train platform and this April yard was that seeing it wasn't enough. You had to be willing to say what you saw out loud, to people who weren't sure they wanted to hear it, in a place that had been constructed to make you doubt yourself, without a guarantee that anyone would believe you, or that it would make any difference even if they did. She had done that. It had not been clean. She had been afraid more than once in ways she hadn't admitted to anyone and barely admitted to herself. She had made guesses that could have been wrong. She had taken risks she couldn't fully calculate in advance because the information wasn't available yet. There had been nights in Ethan's study, when the lamp was low, and the papers were spread across the desk, and she had felt very clearly the specific weight of something that was larger than what she'd expected to be carrying when she stepped off that train. She had carried it anyway, not because she was exceptional, not because she was fearless, because the alternative to see what she saw and look away, to have the skill and refuse to use it, to let a man who had already decided she was powerless be right about, that was a thing she could not make herself do. Some things you can't make yourself do, and you only find out which ones they are when you're standing in front of them. The woman who had stepped off a train in the wind with nothing had not been rescued from that platform. She had walked off it herself, found the hotel, found the work, found the pattern in the numbers, built the case, brought in the people who could act on it, and stayed when staying was hard. There was no version of the story where someone came to save her. There was only the version where she decided what she was made of and moved accordingly. This was, she thought, the thing worth remembering. Not the outcome, which was real and solid and hers in a way she was still learning to accept without waiting for it to be taken away. Not the ranch or the work or the man beside her or the community of people who had come to this yard in April to stand with her. Those were the results of the decision. What mattered was the decision itself, the decision to refuse to become small, not to be invulnerable, not to be without doubt or fear or the ordinary imperfections of a person trying to do something difficult in complicated circumstances. just to refuse at each moment when the pressure came, to collapse into the smaller version of herself that the situation was designed to produce. That refusal had made everything else possible. Ethan was beside her, steady and without ceremony, the way he was present for everything. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was nothing that needed saying out loud, which was its own kind of language. One she hadn't known she'd been learning, until she found that she already spoke it. Ruth spoke the words that needed speaking. The afternoon sun was warm on the yard. The land stretched in every direction, flat and enormous and entirely itself, making no concessions to anything. Clara Prescott stood straight back near the front, her hands at her sides, her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who has almost lost something irreplaceable and knows now what it cost to keep it. Tom Calder stood very still and held his hat in both hands. Lila Hatch was watching the proceedings with something on her face that she was not quite managing to keep neutral, and had apparently decided she didn't need to. The Fenn brothers stood together, shoulders nearly touching, the same as they always did. June, beside Ruth's vacated place, held her notebook and watched everything with the intent, serious focus of someone who has understood that this is the kind of moment a person should not be half present for. Mara had arrived in Black Ridge with $4.32, a broken suitcase, and a promise that had turned out to be an instrument of someone else's design. She stayed because the work needed doing. She remained because the place had become real to her, and she had become real to it. And there is no better definition of home than that not the place you were born to, or the place someone else decided you should occupy, but the place where the shape of who you are fits the shape of what's needed, and both are genuinely better for the fit. Where the work you do matters to people whose lives you've come to know. Where the mornings have a rhythm that belongs to you. Where the person beside you chose you the way you chose him, not out of circumstance or arrangement, but out of the slow, clear-eyed recognition of two people who have seen each other plainly and decided that plainness is enough. It was enough. It was considerably more than enough. It was everything she had never thought to ask for, built from nothing by a woman who had refused, at every turn, to be defined by what had been done to her rather than what she chose to do in response. She was still that woman. She would always be that woman. The difference was that now finally she was also home,